Hello there, I'm Liz the Artist. Luke is a small town boy that moved to the big city and ended up back on the farm. One night, a glow lights up the sky and sets off a chain reaction of strange events that Luke never imagined even city living could produce. Tonight's tale is called WagyU-FO. Luke had been working at the Greater Valley farm for a few years. He had moved to the city from a small town where he grew up working on a cattle ranch. He had moved to the city, ironically, to try new things, but when he arrived, the first and best paying job he could find was at the farm. The Greater Valley farm was on the outskirts of the city and wasn't used completely as a farm. For certain events throughout the year, it was transformed as more of an attraction than a farm. In October, the farm was converted into a haunted house and corn maze. For Christmas, it became Christmas Town, with lights and Santa's workshop. During the spring, there was a festival that highlighted a harvest as well as Easter with visits from the Easter Bunny. The farm was also used for things like concerts, artisan fairs, and RV shows. In between all the special events, the Greater Valley farm was still a farm of sorts. They still produced seasonal crops, but at a much lower volume than they once had. Instead of supplying local grocery stores, they supplied small farmers markets and sold their crops directly instead. People could pay a small fee to pick their own fresh fruits and vegetables. The farm had once housed a large cattle ranch as well, but this had been scaled down a lot over the years. Now a small herd of dairy cows supplied the same farmers markets, and they raised a few steers for slaughter, but most of that meat went to privately owned butcher shops and a few famous local restaurants. Other livestock were also kept on the farm, such as chickens for eggs and sheep for wool. The animals who were not scheduled for slaughter at some point were also used for a petting zoo year-round. The farm was also known locally for taking in rescue dogs and cats. The dogs guarded the livestock from the occasional threat of coyotes or bobcats, while the cats took care of mice and other vermin. The dogs and cats were also very popular in the petting zoo. Luke was a cattleman and was in charge of the steers and the farm's resident bull, Crete. Crete was a permanent resident of the farm, but was not part of the petting zoo. Like most intact bulls, Crete could be unexpectedly aggressive at times, and he was much too large for the petting zoo anyway. The bull was still a farm attraction though, as people who toured the farm got to go by Crete's pen to view him. Crete was primarily used as a stud for the beef cattle the farm raised. He was a Hereford bull, as were the rest of the beef cattle that the farm raised. Some changes had occurred at the farm recently, mostly administratively. A few months before, the farm's owner had been killed in a fire on the farm grounds. A group of people had been discovered trespassing on the farm's haunted house grounds and had been investigated for arson. They claimed that some kind of creature had killed the farm's owner before his body had been burned in the fire. Firefighters and police officers on the scene had confirmed that some kind of wild animal carcass was also found, but they said that its carcass was so badly burned in the fire that it was destroyed before it could be identified. Both the fire and the farm owner's death have been ruled as accidents. After the death of the farm's owner, his wife sold it to an investment firm who elected to keep it operating as it had been. The exception is they had decided to scale back on the production of fruit and vegetable crops so they could clear a section of land near the petting zoo for some small-scale amusement park rides. The new grounds had been constructed and the rides were installed, and the farm was getting ready to open to the public again for the first time since the fire. Luke had been a little shocked at how quickly the farm had been sold, but he understood that the business aspect of things at this point, he was just happy he still had a job. He was looking forward to the farm reopening though. He always enjoyed answering the questions of the children when the tours came through and when he was tending to the petting zoo. Talking to the children also meant talking to their sometimes single mothers, and Luke enjoyed that as well. He wasn't good with the ladies in his nightlife, but on the farm. He was an all-star. One afternoon, Luke had remained at work late because one of the farm's horses was giving birth. After successfully overseeing the birth of the foal, Luke gathered his things and got into his truck to head home. Luke had taken the cheapest place he could find to live when he first moved to town, so his commute was a bit far. He left the farm and stopped at a grocery store to pick up some cat food and a few essentials. He left the store and got onto the freeway to finally go home. Without traffic, it took him about 20 minutes to get to and from work. He exited the freeway and drove through the area, which still seemed somewhat rural, even though it was just across the freeway from the bustling area of the city. It was already dark out as Luke neared home in the early evening, and he was just about home when something caught his attention in the night sky. As he drove, Luke noticed a bright green, oval-shaped light in the sky. He watched the light as he drove, almost completely taking his attention away from the road. Most people would have probably written the light off as an airplane or helicopter, since there was a small private airport nearby. But Luke had studied aviation in high school with dreams of becoming a private sector pilot. He actually had qualified for his student pilot's license, but his parents would not pay for him to take the test. Because of the knowledge of aviation he possessed, Luke knew that the light he was watching could not be an aircraft. Aircraft did not have a single light, but multiple for identification. Aircraft do have a green light, but it is always accompanied by a red one and white ones, so other pilots can determine many factors about the craft once obtaining visual contact. These lights also flash. The bright green light that Luke was witnessing was staying lit solidly, and there were no other lights around it. It also seemed to be traveling much slower than even small private aircraft do. Luke knew that the light could not be an aircraft, and it bewildered him to watch it. Luke continued to drive down the long stretch of rural desert road that led to his house, keeping an eye on the light. Suddenly, something unexpected happened. The light seemed to stop moving altogether, and it hovered in the sky for a few moments. Luke noted that another vehicle was coming down the road from the opposite direction as its headlights became visible. He went back to watching the light in the sky just in time to see it suddenly double in size. Luke watched in amazement, and then, without warning, the light intensified, and for a split second, the entire night sky turned bright green with a flash. The flash was so bright, Luke had to turn his head and shield his eyes. Luke slammed on his brakes and looked back up in time to see the other approaching vehicle swerve off the road and come to a stop on the side. Luke slowly pulled closer to the other car to check on the driver, still completely baffled by what he had just witnessed. As he approached the other vehicle, he could now see that it was also a truck, and a familiar face opened the door and stepped out. It was one of Luke's nearest neighbors. Luke pulled up and put his window down to ask, "Hey Bobby, you alright?" The man had stepped out of his truck and was now standing in the road looking at the sky in the direction that Luke could see in the light. The man turned to look at Luke sitting in his truck and responded by asking, "Did you see that shit?" Luke replied, "Yeah, not sure what that was." The man then pointed out something else in the sky where the light had been. He asked Luke again, "You see that? It left a contrail. Is that a plane?" Luke gazed back at the night sky to see what Bobby was referring to. In the sky, where the light had been, there was now a single line-shaped cloud that did in fact look like the contrails left by jet airplanes. Luke noticed something about it though, and when he did, Luke thought about the Air Force base that was just outside of town, and he continued, "Unless it was something experimental from the base, that was no plane." Bobby began to get back into his truck, and as he stated, "Whatever it was, it scared the hell out of me. That flash was so bright, that's why I pulled over. I've never seen anything like that." Bobby climbed back into his truck and closed the door. He put his driver window down and hung his head out to look back at the sky one last time. Then he told Luke, crazy. Anyway, you may want to keep your kitty cat inside tonight. I saw a big bobcat walking across your front yard as I was leaving. Luke replied, yeah, he's been hanging around for a few days. Ms. Meow will be okay though. She only goes outside when I do and comes back in with me. I'll keep her in until I don't see him anymore. Luke thanked his neighbor for watching out. The two men bid each other farewell and went on their ways. Luke couldn't help but stare at the contrail as he finished his drive home. It piqued his curiosity and reignited his love for aviation. He couldn't help but wonder if they were indeed testing experimental aircraft over at the Air Force Base. Luke finally arrived at home and was greeted when he walked in the door by his cat, Ms. Meow. He set his backpack down, hung up his hat, and gave his cat the attention she was wanting. After a few minutes of scratches and head boops, Luke instructed the cat to follow him into the kitchen, where he then opened a can of cat food that he had stopped for and scooped onto a plate for her. When people visited Luke's house for the first time, they were often surprised he had a cat. Ms. Meow had been one of the rescued kittens from the farm, and she'd grown particularly attached to him. Since cats are so independent, Luke thought it a better choice for a pet since he spent so much time at the farm. Once the cat was eating, Luke walked over to the refrigerator and took out a bottle of beer. He opened it and took a big drink and set it on the countertop. He then retrieved a frozen dinner from the freezer and put it into the microwave. Once the microwave was going, Luke took his phone out of his pocket and looked up the phone number for the Federal Aviation Administration. He wanted to ask about what he had seen in the sky. When he pulled up the information, however, there were guidelines stating that anyone inquiring or reporting unusual sightings should not call the FAA, but rather to call the National UFO Reporting Center, or local authorities if immediate danger or damage was a concern. Luke laughed to himself and scoffed at the thought of reporting what he had seen as a UFO. But after thinking about it for a moment, he realized that what he had seen, by definition, was in fact a UFO. Rather than reporting a UFO, he decided to call the county sheriff's office and inquire if anyone else had reported seeing something. He looked up the phone number and called the non-emergency line. When the operator finally answered, Luke asked if any strange lights in the sky had been reported by anyone. He told them that he had seen something and wanted to check if they had been reported. The operator told them that they had received some reports and looked into it. They told them that an experimental military complex the next state over was launching test rockets, and that they were most likely what people were seeing in the night sky. Luke didn't quite understand how a green light would be produced by such an endeavor, but he accepted what he was told and thanked the operator for taking his call. As he ended the call, the timer on the microwave went off. He took his dinner out and retrieved a fork from one of the kitchen drawers. He scooped up a forkful and took a bite. The surface was hot, but the center was still cold, and he winced as he placed the tray back into the microwave and reset the timer for 2 more minutes. The cat finished her dinner and scurried down the hallway. Luke took another drink of his beer and picked up his phone to check his email while he waited. Suddenly, Luke heard a noise in the backyard. He set his phone down and took another drink from his beer before he walked over to the back door, opened the curtains to look out. He switched on the back porch light, but he didn't see anything. He opened the door and stepped out slowly while looking around. Luke heard another noise and realized it had come from a small tool shed that was in the corner of the yard. He began slowly walking toward the shed, picking up a rake that he had leaning against the house on the way. As he approached the shed, another noise came from behind it, and he paused for a moment. Suddenly, a large bobcat jumped out from behind the shed, and when it saw Luke, it stopped and postured toward him. The cat growled for a moment as the two locked eyes. Luke stood his ground with the rake. He began to shout at the cat to get out of the yard, and he thrusted the rake toward it. The cat turned, and with one graceful leap, it was atop the back wall. The bobcat looked back at Luke and growled one last time before it dropped down on the other side of the wall and disappeared. Luke walked back to the back door and set the rake against the wall where he had gotten it from, and went back inside the house. Once back inside, Luke retrieved his dinner from the microwave and picked up his beer. He walked into the living room area and sat down in his chair. He picked up the remote control and turned on the television. The local news show that he liked to watch was just starting, and they led with a story about the strange lights being spotted over the city. Luke dug into his dinner and drank his beer whilst the news anchor said the same thing the sheriff's office had said about the rockets being tested. He declared aloud, "Bullshit." The story about the lights concluded, and the anchors began talking about national headlines. Luke half listened as he scarfed down his dinner and downed his beer. He turned off the television and threw away the tray from his dinner and his empty beer bottle. He retrieved another beer and walked down the hallway to his bedroom. He had to be back at the farm early in the morning. The next morning, Luke arrived at the farm and everything started out as it usually did. He checked in and put his personal belongings into his locker. He made his way out to the barns and began his morning rounds. One of the first things he always did was release the cattle into the corral so he could clean out the barns. One of the farm's procedures when doing this every morning was to take a head count of the cattle. It seemed a little excessive because of the small size of the farm, but Luke always filled out the paperwork as he was instructed. As Luke released the steers into their pen, he wasn't prepared for what he would encounter at a head count. Luke opened the barn doors and then the stall gates and herded the steers into the corral. He closed the corral gate and turned to walk over to Crete's bullpen. He always liked to say good morning to Crete before he did his head count. He climbed up on one side of the pen wall and peeked his head over the top of the fence. Crete was lying beneath the covered area of his enclosure, still resting. Luke called out to the bull, "Morning, Crete." The bull looked in his direction and let out a snort. Luke told the bull, "I missed you too, you old grump." Then he hopped down off the fence and returned to the barn to fetch the logbook for the head count. He returned to the steer corral from the barn with the logbook and filled out the time and date and printed his name. Luke's parents had taught him to never sign a document without reading it or completing the task outlined on it, depending on the document. So although it seemed silly to some, Luke never signed the head count book until he actually counted the steers, even though he always knew what the count was going to be. Luke looked up from the logbook and actually paid attention to the herd for the first time that morning. He didn't even begin his count, though, before he noticed that something was not right. Toward the side of the corral opposite him, Luke noticed that one of the steers was different. Not in a way like something was wrong with it, or it had changed somehow, but rather it actually looked different than any of the other steers. In fact, Luke realized that he had never seen that steer before. He conducted his head count, which should have been 32 steers, just like the day before, but instead, as he suspected, Luke counted 33. The steer in question was bunched in a group and had its head down as if it were grazing. This was unusual in itself, as these steers were grain-fed in bins and had never spent time grazing in an open field. Only Crete was allowed to do that. So one of the steers attempting to graze inside the dry pen was odd. Luke slowly walked around the corral to get a better look at the steer, and as he got closer, he realized why the steer looked so much different than the others. It wasn't even the same breed as the rest. Luke finally made his way to the other side of the pen, where the steer was rooting around, and as he got close, it caught his scent and looked up at him. As Luke made eye contact with the steer, he realized that he'd never even seen this kind of steer before. All of the cattle on the farm were Hereford. They always had been, since the original farm opened. It had set the farm apart from other local ranches, who primarily raised Angus or Brahman cattle. This steer wasn't any of those breeds, or any of the other rare area breeds that Luke had worked with in the past. Luke's mind began to race with questions. What kind of steer was this? Where did it come from? What was it doing there? Luke looked down at the logbook on the line for the head count, he reluctantly wrote 33. He decided that he'd better go speak with the ranch foreman about the extra steer. The foreman's office was at the main farmhouse, which, since the farm's sale, had been converted into a museum, and the adjoining garage now housed the farm's main offices. Luke walked over to the farmhouse and into the offices. He approached the cubicle of the ranch foreman, who was sitting at his desk, finishing up a phone call. The foreman told the person on the phone, "Okay, sounds good. We'll deliver the steer to the slaughterhouse in the morning, and we're all set." He paused for a moment and then said, "Okay, great. I'll talk to you again soon. Take care." He hung up the phone and looked up at Luke and said, "Good morning, Luke. How's things?" He motioned his hand for Luke to have a seat, and Luke accepted, sitting in the chair that was next to the foreman's desk. Then he replied, "Morning, Oscar. Did you just sell a steer?" The foreman, Oscar, told him, "Yeah, that was Rob from WagyU-FO Steakhouse. Guess his normal supplier had some kind of illness hit his herd. That sucks for them, but it's great for us because we may get Rob's business for a while. At least until they figure out what's making their steer sick." Luke nodded his head in approval of the news and asked, "Is that why there was an extra steer in the barn this morning? You bring that one in for him or from somewhere else?" Oscar looked at Luke confused and said, "What extra steer?" Luke returned Oscar's confusion and then explained by saying, "I just did the head count. There's 33 steers in the pen, and one's not like the other. Did Rob order a different breed that we had to bring in?" Oscar's face contorted with even more confusion. He sat forward in his chair and asked, "What do you mean there's 33? I know. He ordered a Hereford. Said he wanted to see if his customers could tell the difference from Angus." Luke sat back in his chair and replied, "Well, now I'm really confused because that extra steer ain't no Angus either. In fact, I don't know what kind of steer it is." Oscar stood up and picked up his hat and put it on. Then he told Luke, "Show me this steer." The two men exited the offices and walked toward the corral. As they approached, Oscar started scanning the animals, looking for the one that Luke was talking about. He spotted it just as Luke pointed it out, saying, "That one over there, the reddish one." The two men got closer and moved into position to get a better look at the steer. Once Oscar realized what he was looking at, the disbelief showed on his face, and Luke asked him about it. "Oscar, you okay? You look like you're staring at Godzilla." Oscar looked at Luke and replied, "Funny that's the analogy you chose, because if my eyes aren't deceiving me, we may not be looking at a giant Japanese lizard, but it may be Japanese." Luke didn't understand what Oscar was getting at and asked, "I'm sorry, what do you mean?" Oscar looked back at the steer and pointed at it, saying, "If I'm not mistaken, that is a Japanese shorthorn, a Wagyu steer." Luke looked at the steer again and asked, "You messing with me?" Oscar replied, "No. I mean, I could be wrong. I've never worked on a Wagyu ranch or been to Japan, so I've never seen one in person, but it looks like the pictures I've seen." The two men stared blankly at the steer for a moment before Luke asked, "What's it doing here?" Oscar replied, "Beats the hell out of me. Did Dr. Parker get here yet?" Luke answered, "I don't know, I haven't seen him, but I haven't made it around the grounds yet. I did this first like always and came to see you about this." Oscar then told him, "Okay, well, he's supposed to be here to check on the mare that gave birth last night in her foal. I'll see if I can track him down and come verify this. Maybe he can find a tracking chip on it, see where it came from. I don't even know who would keep a steer like this around town." Luke nodded his head and told Oscar to keep an eye out for the veterinarian, and Oscar began walking toward the horse stables to look for him. Luke looked over and stared at the extra steer again. As he did, his gaze was broken and he was startled when Crete let out a loud bellow before slamming headfirst into the bullpen wall. Luke jumped back and then shouted at the bull, "Hey, calm down, you big grouch." Crete let out a snort and then galloped back into the covered area. Luke shook his head and turned and walked back into the barn. He walked inside and opened the logbook that he'd been carrying the whole time. Next to the head count line, where he had written 33 a short time before, he signed his name, closed the logbook, put it back into its cubby, and walked out of the barn. A little later that morning, Luke met up with Oscar and Dr. Barker at the steer corral. They separated the steer in question and walked it back to the barn so the veterinarian could examine it. The first thing the three men noticed when they got up close to the animal was that it was wearing a brisket tag. Oddly enough, the number on the tag was 33, but none of them could read what was printed on the back of the tag because it was in Japanese. Upon examining the beast, the veterinarian confirmed that it was indeed a Japanese shorthorn steer, and it was not an American Wagyu crossbreed. It was a pure red shorthorn. The veterinarian finished what he was doing and told the men that he had to be leaving as he had an appointment with some dogs to attend to. Luke and Oscar returned the steer to the corral and then reconvened in Oscar's office to see if they could look up any information on the brisket tag. Oscar went online to look up Japanese Wagyu ranches, and thanks to a few insider sites, he located the one the steer's brisket tag was from. The two men would be shocked again that day. The brisket tag identified the steer as coming from a ranch in the Tohoku region of Japan. Luke and Oscar stared at the computer screen as if they were waiting for it to say something different because they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Luke asked, almost rhetorically, "How the fuck did a Japanese steer end up here?" Oscar looked at Luke, but had no answer. Luke then asked, "What do we do?" Oscar sat back in his chair the way he always did when he had to think. After a moment, he replied, "Well, normally, when a steer wanders onto a ranch, you contact the owner and work things out. Guess I'll contact the ranch." Luke looked at Oscar with a smirk on his face and then replied, "The ranch in Tohoku, Japan. What are you going to say? Hey, just need to let you know one of your steers wandered onto our property? I think that's way beyond anything that open range law covers. You speak Japanese?" Oscar sat forward and asked, "All right then, where do you think it came from?" Luke thought for a moment, but knew that he couldn't offer any better theory. People said that the farm was on the outskirts or edge of town because it was actually on the border of two cities. The people who lived anywhere east of the farm in the larger city or in its eastern suburbs referred to its location as the outskirts or edge of town. The city on the west side of the farm was actually the largest of the western suburbs, so anyone who lived west of there referred to things in the same way. Located as such, there was no way the steer could have wandered from somewhere else. Luke looked back at Oscar and said, "So let me say this aloud, so I know we're thinking the same thing." Oscar sat back again and motioned with his hands for Luke to go on. Then he crossed his arms to listen. Luke continued, "So someone apparently took this steer from Japan and shipped it across the Pacific and then across one state and into the next and dropped it off in our barn last night." Oscar replied, "Can you think of another logical explanation?" Luke looked around the room for a moment and then shook his head no. And then he asked again, "What do we do?" Oscar considered for a moment and then opened one of his desk drawers and retrieved a two-way radio. He switched it on, pushed the talk button, and said into it, "Martin, you got a copy?" Almost instantly, a response came saying, "Go ahead for Martin. Good morning, Oscar." Martin was the head of security for the farm, which was a foreign concept to Luke. Large production farms and ranches had security, but small farms like the Greater Valley Farm seldom do. Full-time security staff was another new addition brought about by the farm's sale. Before that, the farm hired temporary security for special events. Martin was a young man who was a little overzealous about his job, but he meant well. There were 4 other security guards that worked under Martin's supervision. A young woman named Chelsea worked the day shift with Martin. A middle-aged gentleman named Lorenzo took the swing shift. The night watchman was an older gentleman they called Red, and Teddy was a part-timer who covered days off, mostly Lorenzo's and Red's, so he wasn't always there. It was about the time in the morning when Martin, Chelsea, and Red were performing their shift change duties, so Oscar realized it was a perfect time to call them. Oscar spoke into the radio saying, "Morning, Martin. You guys doing shift change right now? Over?" Martin replied, "Affirmative. We were just about to walk the amusement park grounds. Over." Oscar asked, "Did Red mention anyone coming by the farm or anything unusual that may have happened last night? Over?" The radio remained silent for a moment before Red's voice replied, "Other than that bright green flash of the light Lorenzo wouldn't stop talking about, no, it was a normal, boring night. Over." Oscar replied, "Do me a favor and head over to the guard shack. I'm sending Luke over there now. I'll meet up after I make a phone call. I want to go through some of the security footage from last night. Over." Martin's voice returned to the radio and replied, "Roger that. Be there in 5. Over." Oscar put the radio back into the drawer and closed it. He looked up at Luke and said, "Do me a favor and head over to the guard shack. I want to try and call this ranch in Japan. Tell Martin to pull up the footage from the main entrance, the steer barn, and the bullpen. Don't tell him why. We'll look at it and decide if it needs to be explained when we get there. I'll be there when I'm done on the phone." Luke had a concern, so he addressed it saying, "I haven't had a chance to feed the herd yet due to all the commotion. Creeks can start getting a little ornery." Oscar replied, "Go ahead and drop some feed before you head over to the shack. It's going to take me a few minutes to make this call." Luke then asked, "What about the shorthorn? Did I give it some feed too?" Oscar answered, "I suppose you can try." Luke stood up and left the office. As he was exiting, he passed the dairy manager, Victoria, on her way in. Luke had a bit of a crush on Victoria, so her presence always made him a little nervous. He tipped his hat to her and forced out, "Morning, Victoria," to which she playfully replied, "Good morning, Lucas." Luke then stumbled by her and out the door. Victoria giggled and walked to her desk. Luke walked back to the barn and picked up a fresh bag of grain for the steers. The shorthorn was still in a pen in the barn, so Luke attempted to give it some grain, but it didn't seem interested. Luke wasn't sure what to do, so he told himself he'd go back to this and walked out to feed the rest of the steers. He dumped feed into the corral troughs for the steers and then retrieved another bag from the barn for Crete. He carried it over to the bullpen and dumped it into Crete's trough. The bull rushed over and snorted aggressively at Luke before it began eating. Luke told Crete, "Yeah, I love you too, big guy. Sorry it's late. Don't hate me forever." Then he turned and began walking toward the guard shack. The guard shack was actually a mobile mini trailer that had been converted to the security office. A telescopic tower had been installed on the top of the trailer and had 3 cameras that faced in directions, giving a 360-degree view of the farm. In addition, cameras were present on the main buildings on both the inside and out. The steer barn had a camera that gave a view of the inside of the barn and one that faced the corral, but gave a clear view of the barn door. The bullpen had a camera under the cover that had a wide-angle lens so Crete's entire pen could be seen. It also had an obstructed view of the steer corral and the barn. When Luke arrived at the guard shack, which was located about halfway between the bullpen and the new amusement park area, Martin and the other security guards had already pulled up the footage from the cameras that Oscar requested. When Luke entered the shack, Martin greeted him enthusiastically and asked where Oscar was. Luke reminded him that he was making a phone call and assured him that Oscar would be by soon. As Oscar had expected, Martin then asked why he wanted the security footage pulled up when Red had already reported an uneventful night. As per Oscar's request, Luke told Martin that Oscar would explain. when he arrived. Luke then told Martin that it was probably okay to look through the main entrance footage and that they could just scan through it and fast forward. Martin asked what they were looking for, and Luke replied that they were looking for anyone that may have come onto the farm grounds unauthorized. Martin pulled the footage up on the main monitor and asked Luke, "What time did I start it?" Luke replied, "Well, I was one of the last of the staff to leave and it was almost 7 o'clock, so I guess you can start looking around 6:30. Martin nodded in acknowledgement and entered the start time at 6:30 p.m. He pressed play and then fast forward, and the group began to watch together as the video sped through. They were silent for a few moments as they watched. Literally nothing happened on the video. When the video reached the time of 6:48 p.m., Luke's truck could be seen exiting the main entrance. As they continued to watch, Oscar entered the guard shack. His entrance distracted them all, and all eyes turned to him for a moment. They missed an anomaly on the video footage. As the security team exchanged good morning chatter, the video reached the time of 7:33 p.m. and glitched. The video returned to normal as Martin told Oscar, "Well, you're just in time. We just started going through the footage a minute ago, and all we've seen so far is Luke leaving work." Red pointed at the main monitor and added, "And me getting to work." The rest of the group looked at the monitor to see Red's car driving down the main entrance roadway. The timestamp on the video was 10:45 p.m. Shortly after that, at the timestamp of 11:22, Lorenzo's car could be seen leaving the main entrance. Oscar reached down and hit the fast forward button again to speed the video up further. The group watched as the rest of the video zoomed by, and nothing happened again until they started seeing people arriving for work just before 4 a.m. Oscar told Martin, "Okay, you can stop this one. Let's get to the nitty-gritty. Pull up the footage of the outside of the steer barn." Martin nodded and brought up the video Oscar requested. He began playing it at the same time, 6:30 p.m. When the timestamp reached 6:41 p.m., Luke could be seen entering the open barn door. Luke stated, "That's when I was getting ready to leave. I had just come from helping Frances with the birth in the stables. I told her she can go while I wrap things up. She left about 6:15. The group watched the video as Luke gathered some items and closed the barn door, securing it for the night. Luke disappeared from camera view as he walked away from the barn toward his truck. Martin looked up at Oscar to say something, but stopped himself when he noticed how seriously both Oscar and Luke were watching the video footage. He went back to watching himself, even though he still didn't know what he was looking for. When the timestamp on the video reached 7:33 p.m., the same glitch happened as on the previous video, but this time the group caught it. One moment, the barn door was completely visible, and the next, the monitor screen was a mess of twisted lines and snow. Oscar shouted at Martin to pause the video, and he quickly did. At that point, the picture had cleared up, so Oscar asked Martin to rewind it a bit. Martin rewound past the glitch, and when the picture had cleared, he stopped it and played it in real time. As the timestamp once again reached 7:33 p.m., the video glitched. The group watched in real time. The feed had apparently been knocked out for 3 minutes. At the timestamp of 7:36 p.m., the video returned to normal, and everything else seemed as such. Chelsea asked the obvious question, "What happened to distort the video like that?" Martin replied that he wasn't sure, but speculated that a power surge or some kind of magnetic activity in the atmosphere could have knocked out the feed momentarily. Martin then turned to Oscar and asked, "Does this have anything to do with whatever it is we're looking for? Because you haven't actually told us." All eyes turned to Oscar, including Luke, since Oscar told him he'd explain when he arrived at the shack if needed. Oscar finally replied, "We're looking to see if anyone came onto the property last night and dropped off a steer." The 3 security guards looked at Oscar confused, and then looked at Luke the same way. After realizing that both men were serious, they looked at each other. Red interjected, asking, "You think someone dropped off a steer? I told you that no one came on the property last night. Not while I was here. Lorenzo didn't mention anyone either. Luke looked at Oscar and appeared unsure as to whether or not to elaborate and decided to help explain. He told the security guards, "This morning at head count we had an extra steer. It came from another ranch. We were just trying to figure out how it got in our barn." The three guards again looked at Luke and Oscar like they were out of their minds. Oscar told Martin, "Just pull up the footage from inside the barn, please. Start it just before the time the other camera glitched." Martin looked at his security team and shrugged his shoulders. Then he turned to do as Oscar asked. He brought the footage up and set the start time at 7:30 p.m. At 7:33, as Oscar had evidently suspected, the camera glitched. Oscar told Martin just to keep it playing in real time to see if they could catch anything. For 3 minutes, though, all they could see on the monitor were distorted wavy lines and fuzzy snow. Then, just as the other cameras, at 7:36, the camera went back online. As soon as it did, everyone except Luke started counting the steers. Luke didn't need to. He just pointed it out by placing his finger on the monitor and saying, "It's this one right here." It wasn't there before the camera glitch. Everyone stared at the monitor closely and could see that the steer Luke had pointed out looked a little different from the others. It was confirmation for Oscar, but Martin rewound the video before the glitch happened and paused it. He looked closely at the pen where Luke had pointed out the new steer, and at the rest of the pens. The odd steer appeared to be missing. Then he fast-forwarded past the glitch and paused it again. Luke's steer was there. Martin sat back in disbelief and then looked at Oscar and said, "So someone hacked our cameras and dropped off a steer in our barn. They got onto and off the property doing this, all in just 3 minutes." Oscar looked at Luke and then back at Martin and replied, "It would appear so." Red spoke up again, saying, "Well, I guess that green light wasn't the only weird thing that happened last night." Suddenly, a thought entered Luke's mind that even he couldn't believe, but he decided to investigate it anyway. He asked Red, "Wait, you said Lorenzo was talking about the light. Did you see it?" Red answered, "No, I was still asleep last night when he said it happened. I live so close, I usually don't get up and ready for work until about 9 p.m. Luke then said, "When I left here last night, I stopped by the store by the freeway before I went home. By the time I got in my area, it had to have been around close to 7:30. Did Lorenzo mention what time he saw the light?" Red answered, "He wasn't specific, but he said it was a little before 8. Luke couldn't believe what he was about to present to the group, but he went on anyway and said, "I saw that light too last night. I was driving home. My neighbor saw it too. So did a lot of other people, according to the sheriff's office." The group began to pay close attention, wondering where Luke was going with this. Luke continued, saying, "It said the military was testing missiles in New Mexico. That's what caused the green light and the flash in the sky." He paused for a moment and looked at Martin and Chelsea and asked, "Did you guys see it?" Chelsea replied, "No, I was helping my kids finish their homework before bed." Martin replied, "Nah, I was gaming online with some friends." Luke then asked Oscar, "How about you?" Oscar replied, "My wife and I were watching basketball." Luke paused again to decide how he was going to word what he was going to say next. Then he said, "I wanted to be a pilot. I studied, but it wasn't meant to happen. Anyway, when I saw that light last night, I wanted to call the FAA, but found out that you can't call the FAA about things like that because it's considered a UFO. That's why I called the sheriff. The flash that Lorenzo was going on about happened about the same time the cameras glitched." Martin immediately questioned, "Wait, are you trying to say that light in the sky had something to do with the steer just showing up in the barn last night?" Luke replied, "Either that or the cow jumped over the moon." The group remained quiet for a moment as they all tried to process what had just been said. As things began to get awkward, Luke asked Oscar, Were you able to get a hold of the ranch and the steer's brisket tag? 3 security guards were curious as to what Luke was talking about. Oscar looked a little upset that Luke had put him on the spot, but he never really decided he needed to share the information he had. He looked around at everyone and then back at Luke and said, "Yeah, I did. It's about..." Oscar took his phone from his pocket to check the time and continued, 11:30 at night there right now. So I was only able to speak with someone on the night security shift. He said that the ranch was missing a steer the day before, but he wasn't keen on any more information. If I want to talk to the ranch foreman, I'll have to try calling tonight." Martin was again the first question as he asked, "Wait, are you trying to say that this extra steer came from Japan and just got dropped off here last night?" Oscar and Luke looked at each other, and then Oscar said, "I'm not sure what is going on any more than you are. All I know is I have a ranch in Japan that's missing a Wagyu steer, and that steer, for some reason, is currently in our barn refusing to eat grain." Luke added to what Oscar said, stating, "And our security cameras all glitched at the same time the steer appeared." Oscar said, "I can't explain what happened, and all I know is I have a very expensive steer in my barn that we have to keep healthy until the owner figures out what the hell I'm supposed to do with it. At this point, I'm not even sure I care how it got here." Martin interjected, asking, "What are you going to tell Philip?" Philip was the farm superintendent. He was the big boss man sent by the new investor owners. He was in charge of all the farm operations. Beneath him were a set of supervisors who specialized in specific areas of the farm. Oscar was the ranch foreman. Victoria was the dairy manager. The stables were overseen by a young man named Tommy. Stephen was the head farmer, and the young woman named Serenity was hired to manage the amusement park. Oscar answered, "I'm just going to be honest with him. If he doesn't want to believe me, that's on him. My plan is just to operate as normal and deal with this as best we can." Martin stood up from his chair and asked, "So, should we go finish our shift change rounds so Red can go home?" Oscar replied, "Yes, absolutely. Thanks for staying a little later than normal, Red. I'll explain to Philip why you clocked out late." Red nodded his head, and the security team left the trailer to finish their morning rounds. Oscar told Luke, "Check on the steer and see if it's eaten anything. If not, let me know. I'll look up a list of what to feed it. We should have something on the farm that will suffice. I'm going to find Philip and let him in on this nonsense." Luke acknowledged, and Oscar left the trailer. Luke was curious about something that he couldn't explain. He looked down at the monitor. Martin had paused it at the timestamp of 7:36 p.m., right when the camera had come back online. Luke reached down and pressed the rewind button, and then immediately paused it again. The footage stopped at the timestamp of 7:34, in the middle of the distortion. Luke studied the paused screen for a moment. As he focused closer, he wasn't sure whether or not to believe his own eyes as he attempted to decipher the distortion. He swore to himself that through the wavy lines of the glitch, he could almost see the outline of a human figure. The rest of the day went on as usual despite the chaos and confusion of the morning. It turned out that Philip wasn't even on the property that day. He had taken some time off to go on a hunting trip and sent an email from his campsite. Oscar decided to keep things as much under wraps as he could to avoid causing unnecessary problems in other areas of the farm. The shorthorn ate a little of the grain feed that Luke had given it, but Oscar was concerned that it hadn't eaten enough. After researching the ranch that the steer had supposedly come from, Oscar found a list of things that the steer may have normally been fed. After acquiring some apples, fresh alfalfa, and potatoes from the farm, and making a quick run to the grocery store by the freeway for a bottle of red wine, Luke was able to get the shorthorn to eat a hearty meal. The only other thing that Luke noticed seemed off that day was Creed's behavior. Creed had always been a cranky bull, but that day he seemed extra aggressive. He rammed at the fence of the bullpen every time Luke walked close enough, but when Luke climbed up on the fence to check on him, the crate back down and just stared at Luke. It was almost like seeing Luke was comforting Crete. This was a behavior that Luke hadn't seen before in Crete, or in any other bull he had ever worked with, for that matter. As the day drew to a close, Luke finished up his daily task and got ready to do his final head count of the day. He retrieved the logbook from the barn and propped the doors open so he could lead the herd in for the night. He walked over to the corral and counted. Somehow, counting 33 steers still seemed wrong to him, but he included the shorthorn in his count again. He wondered what they were going to do with the steer. Would its home ranch pay to transport it back? Or would the Greater Valley Farm end up buying it? He looked over at the shorthorn, which they had put back in the corral with other steers, and thought to himself that it would be an expensive purchase. Forget trying to resell. The workday on the farm ended at 5 p.m., and it was quickly approaching as Luke put the logbook back and walked over to the corral to walk the steers to the barn. He opened the gate and began guiding them to the barn. He noted to himself that the shorthorn seemed pretty docile and got along well with the Herefords. As the steers made their way into the barn for the night, Oscar approached. He helped Luke get the rest of the cattle into the barn and in their pens. When they were finished, he said to Luke, "I hate to do this to you since you stayed late yesterday, but I thought maybe we could have a talk with Lorenzo. Martin told me before he left that Lorenzo didn't have any more information about what happened last night, but I'd rather talk to him myself. I was hoping you wouldn't mind staying a bit late again and speaking to him with me." Luke agreed. Oscar continued saying, "Before we do that though," he paused and took his phone out of his pocket to look at it. He put it back in his pocket and said, "It's almost 9 a.m. in Japan right now. Why don't you come with me to my office and we'll try giving that ranch a call again?" Luke agreed again, and the two men closed the barn doors and walked over to the offices. As they approached the farmhouse, the other area managers were all leaving for the day. Victoria was walking out of the offices as they were walking in. She stopped and asked Luke, "You staying late again, Lucas? Don't you ever have any fun?" Oscar stood by and watched as it seemed like he wasn't even there for a few moments. Luke replied to her, "Sure I do. My cat and I watch cartoons every night before we go to bed." Victoria giggled and responded, "Maybe you should try hanging out with someone other than your cat every once in a while. Not that I don't like cats. Have a good night, Lucas." She started to walk away, but stopped a few steps away and turned back to say, "Have a good night, Oscar." Then she turned back around and walked to her car. Oscar asked Luke, "You ever gonna ask her out?" Luke replied, "That depends. You ever gonna give me a day off to take her out?" The two men shared a laugh and entered the office. Once inside, Oscar sat at his desk and Luke in the chair next to it. Oscar picked up the office phone and dialed the number that he had been given earlier by the Japanese ranch's overnight security. He felt very American dialing the international number. Finally, the phone started to ring. Oscar set the phone to speaker mode and the two men waited. After a few rings, a female voice answered the phone, but the only thing that Oscar could make out was the name of the ranch when she said it. Oscar replied to the voice, "Hello, I'm calling from America. Do you speak English?" The voice replied, "Yes, good morning. This is Kuriyama Kogen Ranch. How may I help you?" Oscar replied, "Good morning. My name is Oscar Ruiz, and I am the ranch foreman for the Greater Valley Ranch in the United States. I was hoping I could speak with your foreman or anyone who has access to your herd records. It's going to sound strange, but I need to find out if your ranch is missing any steers." When the female voice replied, Oscar could detect a degree of urgency in her voice. She said, "One moment, please. You will need to speak to Nishiki. He is the ranch foreman. He speaks English as well. I will transfer you." Oscar responded, "Thank you so much for your help." The phone went silent for a moment before another male voice could be heard saying, "Hello, my name is Nishiki Oyama. I am told you were asking about our missing steer." Luke and Oscar looked at each other as they were both a little surprised. Oscar replied, "Yes, hello, Mr. Uyama. My name is Oscar Ruiz. I'm ranch foreman at the Greater Valley Farm. I was calling to ask if you were missing a steer, but you've already answered my question. So, you say that you are missing one?" Nishiki replied, "Yes, we are. Yesterday morning, when our cattlemen performed their daily head count, we discovered we were missing one. We sent men out to search, but have not found it." Oscar looked toward Luke as if he were seeking his approval for what he was going to say next. But Luke motioned with his hands for Oscar to continue. Oscar asked, "The animal you're missing, was it wearing a brisket tag for number 33? For a few moments, only silence was heard on the phone speaker. Finally, Nishiki responded, "Yes, it is. Do you have our steer? I've never heard of the Greater Valley Farm. Are you a private farm? Where are you located? I was told you are in the United States?" Oscar replied, "I believe we do have your steer, Mr. Uyama, but as far as our location, well, you may find it hard to believe." He hesitated for a moment and continued saying, "Mr. Uyama, my farm is in Arizona." The phone went silent again for a moment before Nishiki asked, "Arizona? Is this a joke? How did you know I was missing a steer? I will call authorities." Oscar attempted to calm Nishiki, saying, "Hold on, Mr. Uyama, that won't be necessary. I don't know how to explain it, but if you have an email that I can send you some pictures to, I think you'll find that I'm telling the truth." After another brief hesitation, Nishiki provided Oscar with an email address, and Oscar picked up his mobile phone and sent him a series of pictures that he had taken of the steer that morning. These included pictures of the steer's brisket tag and a picture of the farm's main entrance for reference. Then he said, "Okay, Mr. Uyama, I just sent them." After a few moments of silence, Nishiki answered, "How is this possible?" Oscar replied, "I can't answer that any more than you can, Mr. Uyama. I just know that if any one of my steers just vanished, I'd want to do my best to find out what happened." He paused for a moment, but when Nishiki remained silent, he continued saying, "In the past, I've dealt with wandering steers by just returning them to the ranch they came from, but you understand the unusual uniqueness of this situation." This time, Nishiki replied, "Yes, of course. I will speak to my superior and contact you when we know what to do." The two men exchanged detailed contact information, including personal and mobile numbers, and ended the conversation. Once the phone was hung up, Luke asked Oscar, "What do you think is going to happen with that?" Oscar replied, "Have you ever looked up how much it costs just to transport a dog or cat across the country? I imagine they're either going to try to sell the steer to us or work out a deal where we can sell it for them." Luke nodded his head in agreement, as it was what he had envisioned himself. Oscar opened a desk drawer and took out his two-way radio again. He pushed the button and said, "Lorenzo, you got a copy?" After a brief moment, Lorenzo's voice answered, "Yeah, go ahead, Oscar." Oscar then told him, "Luke and I are going to head over to the guard shack. Would you mind meeting us there?" A moment later, the office door opened, and Lorenzo walked in saying, "I might have saved you a few steps." He walked over to the desk where Luke and Oscar were sitting and asked, "What's going on?" Oscar replied, "Did Martin fill you in on the unusual event we had last night?" Lorenzo replied, "You mean the WagyU steer? Yeah, that's really weird, huh? No one came onto the property while I was here." Oscar then asked, "Now, according to the cameras, the steer showed up in the barn sometime around 7:30. Are you absolutely sure no one came onto the property at that time?" Lorenzo got a little defensive and replied, "Well, yeah, I wasn't even in the shack at that time. I was making rounds and I was out by the amusement park. If anyone had come near the barn, I would have at least seen some lights." Luke couldn't help but to interject, asking, "Speaking of lights, Red mentioned you saw that bright green light up in the sky last night?" Lorenzo responded, "Saw it? It was right above me." I first noticed it because it was a little off in the distance, and then it was traveling really slow, like a helicopter looking for something. I didn't think too much of it though, until it lit up the farm. Oscar asked, "What do you mean it lit up the farm?" Lorenzo replied, "Well, like I said, I noticed it again when it was right above the farm. I was checking the amusement park grounds and everything around me sort of lit up green. I looked up and there it was. I couldn't really make out the shape or type of aircraft it was. It just looked like a glowing green egg. I watched it for a few minutes while it just hovered there and then started moving slowly again. I watched it as it headed north for a ways, and then suddenly there was a bright green flash that lit the sky. You know, the one people keep talking about on the news. After the flash, it was gone." Luke then asked, "Lorenzo, did Martin tell you that we reviewed the security footage from last night?" Lorenzo nodded his head and then added, "Yeah, he said all the cameras were glitching." Luke clarified, saying, "Actually, they all glitched at the same time for 3 minutes. You remember what time it was when the farm lit up?" Lorenzo replied, "I was doing my second set of rounds for the night, so it had to have been around 7... Wait. You think that thing in the sky made the cameras glitch?" Luke replied, "I think it may have done more than that." Lorenzo looked at Luke confused, and Oscar looked at him and appeared a little annoyed and told Lorenzo, "Luke has a theory that the aircraft dropped off the steer." Lorenzo looked at Luke again and asked, "For real?" Luke replied, "All I'm saying right now is that the thing in the sky, the camera glitch, the steer appearing in the barn all happened about the same time. Cameras were all knocked out from 7:33 to 7:36. 3 minutes doesn't seem like long enough to pull off a drop-off like that, especially when you're watching the thing the whole time. But so far as I'm the only one who's offered up any kind of explanation, even if it is crazy theory." There was an awkward silence for a moment before Oscar interrupted, saying, "Look, we're all trying to figure out how the steer got here, but I'm ready to call it a day. Hopefully the ranch in Japan gets back to me about what to do soon. Lorenzo, we just wanted to hear from you for your input on this. Luke, thanks for staying. Now go home and get some rest." Lorenzo nodded his head and turned to leave the office. Luke and Oscar finished up things before they both left for the day. Lorenzo had returned to the guard shack and was sitting in front of the camera monitors. He watched on the camera when Oscar and Luke left. He sat quietly in thought for a moment and then reached forward and brought the cameras that were atop the guard shack tower. He focused on the one that faced the amusement park area and pulled up security footage from the previous night. He rewound the footage to 7:30 p.m. and pushed play. He watched himself on camera walking around the amusement park area. He began to recall the previous night as he watched the events on the monitor. He watched himself look up at the sky at 7:31 p.m. He watched himself on camera as he appeared to freeze where he was standing. The light began to illuminate the scene as the camera glitched at 7:33, just like the others. Lorenzo continued to watch the wavy lines and snowy interference for 3 minutes. Then when the signal cleared again, he watched himself still standing there, seemingly frozen and still staring at the sky. He watched himself on camera as he remained frozen in the stance. As the light that brightened the picture went away, he watched in horror as his image remained frozen on the monitor. When he realized he had no recollection of this, he continued to watch, until finally, as the clock timer reached 7:42, he saw himself move on the monitor. He watched himself looking around confused for a moment, still not remembering doing so. Then he watched himself move on to continue his rounds. Lorenzo sat back absorbing everything that he just watched. He thought about the memory of the previous evening that he had recollected to Luke and Oscar, and how it seemed different now. The only thing he could think to say to himself was, "What the fuck?" Red noticed that Lorenzo seemed a little off when they did shift change that night. He asked Lorenzo if something was bothering him, but all Lorenzo told him was that he was just a little weirded out by the events of the previous evening. They walked the grounds together as usual, and everything seemed normal. All save the Japanese steer that still had no explanation for being in the barn. Still, Red had been in this world long enough to know when something was bothering someone, and he had a natural, empathetic tendency to try to help people when they weren't quite themselves. When Lorenzo was ready to go home for the night, Red decided to walk him to the parking lot. He made small talk with him on the way in an attempt to gauge his reaction to certain topics. He thought that maybe he could get a better idea of what may be bothering Lorenzo. They reached the parking lot area where Lorenzo had parked his motorcycle, and as he packed his saddlebags and donned his riding gear, Red decided to ask him one more time if he was okay. He asked, "You sure you're okay, Lorenzo? You seem to be really distracted tonight." Lorenzo, who was about to put his helmet on, stopped and tucked it under his arm instead. He paused for a moment and thought while Red waited patiently. Then Lorenzo looked at Red and said, "Something strange happened here last night. Something none of us can explain. It's affected more than we realize. I watched some security footage from last night and now I don't even trust myself anymore." He stopped and put on his helmet and mounted his bike. He turned back to Red in an unsettling tone said, "Stay safe tonight, Red." Then he started his bike and rode away. Red stood there and watched him ride off, hoping that he'd be okay with whatever was bothering him. Hours later, Red was finishing up his lunch break in the guard shack. Both Red and Lorenzo were required to take their lunch breaks in the shack because they were both the only people on site when it came time for their lunches, and they could keep an eye on security cameras while they ate and rested. Red only had a few minutes left before he had to clock back in, but he was taking his time enjoying the cornbread he had made when he got home from work the morning before. He popped the last piece of the cornbread into his mouth and washed it down with some coffee. As he sat sipping his coffee, he stared at the monitors, not really paying attention. He was deep in thought about how odd Lorenzo was acting. Suddenly, out of the corner of his eye, Red saw movement on one of the monitors. He set his coffee mug down and focused on the monitor. No more movement could be seen, so Red told himself he must have been seeing things. He looked up at the time clock and saw that it was time to punch back in, so he took one last swig of his coffee and packed his lunch bag up. Then he walked over to the time clock and clocked back in. He picked up his flashlight and exited the guard shack to begin his post-lunch rounds. Everything seemed normal to him as he made his way around the amusement park area, checking every nook and cranny as he went with his torch. Red would always check the farmhouse after the amusement park area, and then he would circle back to the guard shack to sign the logbook. He had another reason for checking the farmhouse next, though. Red knew every area of the main grounds that the cameras could see and every area they could not see. And he had a nightly ritual that would lead him to one of these areas that they could not. Red walked over to the farmhouse and around to the back porch area. He turned the corner and stepped up onto the porch. Against one of the walls was an old dairy pail that was just there for show. Next to it sat the stool that once paired up with the pail in the dairy area. Every night on his post-lunch break rounds, Red would sit on that stool next to the pail and smoke a joint. Red was an athlete in his younger days, and as a result of numerous injuries he had sustained over the years, he had suffered from chronic pain now that he was older. Red's painkiller of choice was marijuana, and he saw his nightly ritual as a harmless act, despite being on the clock. He figured that since he used it for medicinal purposes, and since he was the only one on site, that it was okay to do. Nothing ever happened anyway. Red pulled his stash and his rolling papers from his jacket pocket and began to roll himself a joint. When he was finished, he glanced around, but knew no one else would be around. It was one of the things that Red liked most about the job. No one ever came around the farm in the middle of the night. He was always alone after Lorenzo and Teddy left. He liked working alone during the quiet of the nights. He lit the joint and took a big puff. He held it in for a moment, savoring it, then exhaled. He began to cough a little, and as he did, he was startled when he thought he heard a noise through the sound of his cough. He got up from his stool and peeked around the corner, but didn't see anything. He shrugged it off and sat back down to finish the joint. He took puff after puff and as he took his time, he looked up at the sky inside, wishing he could see more stars in the sky, but the light pollution of the city only allowed the brightest stars to shine through. Then he remembered the night before and wondered just how that thing in the sky was able to light up the whole sky like everyone said it did. He was almost finished with his joint and took one last puff before retrieving a small plastic bottle from his jacket. He popped the lid and placed what was left of his joint into the bottle, closed the lid, and placed the bottle back into his pocket. As he did so, he heard another noise. He stepped down from the porch and began to look around. Then he heard Crete let out an angry-sounding snort. At first, he thought to himself, oh, it was just Crete. But then he realized that he didn't know what was making Crete so angry. He took his torch off his belt and began walking toward the bullpen. He could hear Crete still rustling around and quickened his pace to see if he could find out what was going on. As he passed the back end of the barn and turned the corner, he could see Crete pacing back and forth inside the bullpen. He approached the pen and peeked through some of the boards. He called out to the bull, "Crete, what's the matter, you big baby? Something spook you?" Crete stopped pacing and looked in Red's direction, let out a loud grunt. Red began looking around the bullpen with his flashlight, but didn't find anything unusual. Finally, Red glanced over toward the barn and saw that the barn doors were partially open. Red changed his grip on his torch to a defensive position and slowly walked toward the barn. When he reached the barn doors, he stopped and called out, "Who's in there? Come on out." He heard the steers inside begin to stir. He stepped a little closer to the open doors and called out again, "No trespassing on private property. Come on, peacefully and charges will be minimized." The only response he received was a few moves and snorts from the steers inside. He cautiously approached the door and called out, "I'm coming in. There's no back door." Although Red was older, his physical size was still intimidating to most people, which is one reason he could do his job. He was thinking some teenagers had snuck into the barn and he could handle them. He was not expecting what he actually saw when he entered the barn. He squeezed through the open doors and lifted his torch to look around. He shone the light toward the back of the barn and couldn't believe his eyes. Red could now see why the steers were rustling around nervously. At the back of the barn, the Japanese shorthorn was doing something no other bovine had ever been seen doing. The steer was still tethered to the stall, but it was somehow levitating about 3 feet above the ground. Red and the steer actually made eye contact, and as the steer seemed to be floating, it let out a loud moo that seemed directed at Red. Red stood frozen for a moment, deciding whether or not to believe his own eyes. He thought to himself that he had smoked some of the really good stuff in his life, but nothing had ever made him hallucinate. Suddenly, the steer dropped back down to the ground and came to rest on its hooves ever so gracefully. The steer was still looking at Red. Once planted on the ground, it lunged forward and let out a haunting, distressed bellow. Red dropped his torch and backed out of the barn doors. He turned and ran toward the parking lot. A few moments after he ran off, another figure crept out of the barn door and ran off into the darkness. A few hours later, Luke was one of the first to arrive at the farm, as always. He was a little surprised when he didn't see Red's car in the employee parking area, but he shrugged it off as he was still trying to shake the early morning fog from his head. He parked, gathered his bag and his coffee, and went about his normal morning routine. Luke was finished with his head count and was in the middle of filling the water troughs when he saw Martin approaching. He paused what he was doing for a moment and greeted him, saying, "Morning, Martin. You're out and about early today." Martin walked up and stood close to Luke, then replied, "Good morning, Luke. You seen Red?" Luke jokingly replied, "He's usually with you right now, doing shift change. What, did you lose him?" Martin seemed distracted and was looking around while Luke spoke. Luke's mood changed from joking to concerned, and he asked, "Have you seen him at all this morning?" Martin focused on Luke for a moment and responded, No, his car isn't here and he hasn't clocked out, but we looked around and we can't seem to find him anywhere. Luke took off his hat and scratched his head. He put his hat back on and said, I noticed his car wasn't here when I got here, but didn't pay much attention to it. Where's Chelsea? Is she here today? Martin replied, Yeah, we both looked for Red when she got here. She's in the guard shack right now pulling up camera footage to see if we can figure out where he is. Almost on cue, Chelsea's voice could be heard from Martin's radio asking, Martin, you got a copy? Martin took his radio off his belt and answered, saying, Yeah, go ahead, Chelsea. Chelsea quickly replied, I figured out where Red is. You may want to come watch this. Martin and Luke looked at each other and intrigued. Then Martin replied to Chelsea, saying, Copy that, Chelsea. Luke and I are going to head over to see what you found. Over. Martin clipped his radio back onto his belt and asked Luke, Would you mind coming with me? Luke nodded his head in agreement, and the two began walking toward the guard shack. As they walked, the rest of the early staff began to arrive. They reached the guard shack and entered. Chelsea was sitting at the monitor desk. She greeted Luke and Martin, asked her where Red was and what she had found. Chelsea pointed to the main monitor on which she had pulled up the camera that faces the barn doors. She told the two men, Well, we can't find Red because he left for the night almost right after lunch. Martin asked, He left? To which Chelsea replied, Just watch. As she pressed play on the footage, she had paused. Luke and Martin each hunched down over one of Chelsea's shoulders and leaned on the desk to get a closer look at the screens. They watched the footage and saw the camera glitch like the night before. However, this time it was very brief. When the signal cleared, they could see that the barn door was ajar. Luke asked, Someone was in the barn? Chelsea replied, I don't know, but watch for a minute. Luke looked at Martin confused, but Martin could only shrug his shoulders. The men returned to watching the screen. After a few moments, Red could be seen, cautiously approaching the barn doors. They watched him enter the barn and, a few moments later, running out of the barn and out of camera view. Then the camera momentarily glitched again, and when the signal cleared again, they could see that the barn door was closed. Martin asked, Wait, so where did Red go? Chelsea didn't say anything, but switched the main monitor to the camera that faced the employee parking area. She set the time to just after what they had watched on the other monitor and pressed play. The three watched footage as Red could be seen running to his car, getting in, and speeding away. Chelsea then repeated the process with the camera that faced the main entrance, and the group watched Red drive off the property. Martin spoke his first thought aloud, stating, Well, that explains why he didn't clock out. Luke asked, You tried calling him? To which Martin replied, Yeah, but he's not answering. I texted him too, but it's still on red. Luke then asked, What are you going to do? Martin stared at the floor for a moment in thought and then replied, Luckily tonight is Red's night off. Teddy will be in for the overnight. Guess I better brief Teddy on what's been going on. I'll keep trying to get in touch with Red. Luke then asked Chelsea, What about the interior barn camera? What the hell scared him so bad? Chelsea sighed, pulled up the camera footage Luke was referring to and said, I looked for that too, but the camera just says this. Chelsea pushed play on the main monitor again, and the three watched footage of the inside of the barn. At first, everything was normal, but after a minute, the camera glitched again, and this was different from the previous glitches they had seen. This time the screen didn't blur with snow and wavy white lines. Instead, the footage began to loop. It was like watching a GIF on the internet that repeated over and over. This went over for several moments before the footage resumed what appeared to be real-time play. Luke and Martin let out a simultaneous, What the hell? Luke asked, Is someone hacking our cameras as a joke? Martin shook his head furiously and replied, No, there's no way they could. Our cameras are internal only. They're not connected to an external server. There's no path for someone to hack into them. Just then, Oscar's voice could be heard coming over the two security guards' radios. Martin, you got a copy? They both squealed with feedback, and Chelsea turned down the volume on hers. Martin then responded, Come back with that, Oscar. We had some feedback. Over. Oscar's voice replied, Are you seeing Luke this morning? Martin replied. Yeah, Oscar. He's here in the guard shack with me and Chelsea. I hate to say it, but more strange happenings overnight, Oscar. We're looking at some of the footage right now. Over. Oscar's voice again replied.
Yeah, let him know to come by my office when he gets a chance. Over.
Luke motioned with his thumb for Martin to trigger his radio. When he did, Luke called out, Roger that, Oscar. On my way. Luke told Chelsea and Martin that he would talk with the two of them later and left the guard shack. He walked straight to the office and was intercepted by Victoria, who had just arrived. Good morning, Lucas, she said to him as he removed his hat and opened the door for her. Morning, Victoria, he nervously replied. She asked him, Did you guys figure out where your Japanese cow came from? She walked through the doorway and Luke followed. As he closed the door behind him and placed his hat back onto his head, he replied, It's a steer, and actually, yeah, we did find out where it came from. We just don't know how it got here. Victoria sarcastically asked, What, did it come all the way from Japan or something? Luke just smiled at her. Are you shitting me? She asked him. Before Luke had a chance to answer, Oscar called out to him. Good morning, Luke. I talked to the ranch in Japan again, and they have a plan. Luke looked over at Victoria and pointed at Oscar. She opened her eyes wide and told him, You're gonna have to fill me in later. Then she ducked into her cubicle and sat down. Luke walked over to Oscar and asked, So what's the plan, Sensei? Very funny, Oscar replied. Luke sat in the chair next to Oscar's desk and said, Sorry, boss, what's the plan? We're gonna push Ushi out there onto a plane? Oscar asked sarcastically, Will you speak Japanese now? To which Luke replied, I looked over a few things over the last couple of days. Seriously, what's the plan? Oscar shook his head and laughed before replying, The Kuriyama Kogen Ranch is having their sales team call around some places here locally, restaurants, slaughterhouses, places that might be interested in buying a Wagyu steer. There's that butcher shop on the north side that only deals in high-end meats. I told them about that place too. Obviously, the plan is to sell the steer here rather than transport it back to Japan. Luke sat back in his chair and tipped his hat up onto his head. He replied, So in the meantime, I gotta take care of it. Oscar had a reply for that too, stating, They have already compensated us for the wine we purchased and crops we had to use from our market. Once the steer is sold, they're going to compensate you and I personally for handling. We're going to cover the board until it sells. Luke was taken back a little by the plan and had to question it, saying, They're going to pay us to take care of their $10,000 steer until they find a buyer for it, but the farm agreed to board it for free. How'd you swing that? Oscar sat back in his chair and proudly proclaimed, I didn't have to swing anything. I got in touch with Philip and he did the rest. This little incident may have turned into a lucrative business venture for the farm. They're going to try and work out an importing deal where we handle the stateside distribution of their beef. Luke's eyes opened wide with surprise. He told Oscar, Seems a little weird and borderline suspicious, but damn. Oscar sat forward and reiterated by saying, I know, right? Talk about making lemonade from lemons. Anyway, just go about your days as normal. The reopening to the public is coming. We need to make sure the farm is ready. Luke realized that Oscar wasn't aware of the Red situation. He was the one that was going to need to tell him. He started by saying, Not everything is back to normal. I assume you haven't heard about Red yet. Oscar sat back again and tipped his hat up, asking, What happened to Red? Luke answered, Last night something spooked him, and he walked out on his shift just after lunch. Ran out would be a more accurate way to describe it. That's why I was in the guard shack. We were watching the security footage again from last night. He literally ran out of the barn to his car and drove away like his life depended on it. Oscar had been busy, and this was the first time he'd heard. He sat quietly trying to process what he had just been told. Finally, he asked Luke, Did everything look normal to you when you got here? Luke replied, Yeah, I mean, I noticed his car wasn't here when I got here, but everything was normal in the barn and all. Oscar then asked, Martin hasn't been able to contact him, Luke replied. No, he's not answering calls or texts. He's scheduled out tonight, so Teddy will be in. Martin's hoping to sort some things out before Red's scheduled to work again. Oscar then asked, "You said something spooked him?" Luke took a deep breath and replied, "Yeah, but just like the night the steer showed up, the cameras were acting all funky. One inside the barn was playing an endless loop. Things just keep getting weirder around here." Oscar stood up and declared, "Well, hopefully Red is okay, but let Martin handle that. You need any help getting caught up on things this morning?" Luke shook his head and said, "No, I'm alright. I was actually a little ahead when Martin pulled me aside. There is one other thing, though." Luke stood as well, and Oscar asked him, "What is it?" Luke replied, "Well, it's just... Well, I noticed that Creed's been acting a bit more ornery the last couple of days. Everyone needs to be extra careful around him. I don't think he likes the shorthorn, or whoever brought it here." Oscar patted Luke in the arm and said, "Good looking out. I'll put out a memo for everyone to be careful around the bullpen." The day went on, and the rest of it seemed relatively normal to everyone. Luke couldn't stop thinking about Red, though. Martin tried several more times throughout the day to contact him, but still got no response. The workday came to an end, and as Luke climbed into his truck, he decided he was going to personally check on Red. Red had invited Luke over a time or two to watch sporting events, which wasn't something he did with everyone. Luke thought that he might be the only one at the farm who knew where Red lived, so he felt even more responsible for checking on him. Luke left the farm and headed straight for Red's apartment. Red lived in a rougher part of town than Luke did, and Luke always got funny looks from people when he showed up at Red's complex wearing his cowboy hat. This evening wasn't any different. Luke had stopped for a six-pack of beer on his way as a friendly gesture, and he did his best to smile at the jaws that dropped on his way to Red's door. He reached Red's apartment and knocked on the door. A few moments went by with no answer, and Luke knocked again. Just when he was beginning to worry, he heard someone fumbling with the door locks from the inside. The door opened, and Red greeted him, saying, "Luke, what are you doing here?" Luke replied, "I came to check on you. Everything all right? Martin's been trying to get a hold of you all day." Red poked his head out the door and looked around as if to check if Luke had been followed. Then he motioned for Luke to come in, and Luke did so. Red closed the door behind him and invited him to sit down. Before sitting, Luke offered the six-pack to Red, and he graciously accepted, saying, "Luke, you're a lifesaver. Here, take one." He pulled a bottle from his pack and handed it to Luke. Luke accepted and thanked him and sat down as Red walked to the kitchen. Red returned from the kitchen a few moments later with his own beer and took a seat in the living room with Luke. Red took a big drink from his beer and then sat quietly for a moment. Luke decided to ask, "You okay, Red? We watched the security footage from last night." Red looked at Luke, and Luke could see fear in Red's eyes, but didn't understand why. Red took another drink of his beer and looked at Luke and said, "I've seen a lot of things in my life, but nothing like what I saw last night. I'll even admit that I was high when I saw it, but I know I didn't imagine or hallucinate it. Tell Martin I'm sorry, but I quit. I'll put it in writing if he wants me to, but I ain't going back to that farm." Luke was completely dumbfounded. What could have scared Red so bad that he was quitting his job? He took a drink from his beer, sat forward, and told Red, "If that's how you feel, I'm not going to try and change your mind. I've quit jobs out of nowhere for my own reasons before. I just want to make sure you're all right. What was it that spooked you, Red?" Red sat back in his chair, drank down the rest of his beer, and said, "It's that steer, Luke. Something ain't right about it. That barn door was open when I walked in there last night. There it was, levitating, like a pretty girl in a magic act." Luke became skeptical and asked, "It was levitating?" Red stood up and began pacing back and forth. He began a rant, saying, "I know it sounds crazy, but I swear it was, Luke. It was just floating there. It looked at me and cried out like it was scared. The cow ain't wrong. Whatever is messing with it. Messing with us. It is. Luke took a moment to think before saying anything. What Red was telling him sounded crazy, but no crazier than everything else that had been happening at the farm lately. He decided to change the subject just a little because Red looked really uneasy. He asked Red, "So, what are you gonna do to get by? You got anything to fall back on?" Red stopped pacing and asked Luke if he wanted another beer. Luke showed Red that his bottle was still half full and graciously declined. Red grabbed another beer from the refrigerator and sat back down. He told Luke, "Yeah, well, sort of. I can call the temp agency that I worked for before. Spring is here. That means baseball, golf tournaments, concerts. You should have plenty of work for me until I find something more permanent. Heck, I may even end up working an event at the farm. Hopefully that steer's gone by then." Luke smiled, and he was starting to feel like Red was okay. He replied, "Yeah, I mean, we're really close to the grand reopening, and I think I heard someone say they've had a few events lined up already." He finished his beer and stood up to leave. He told Red, "Well, bud, I have to get home and get some rest. Just wanted to check on you, make sure you're okay. As for that steer, it should be gone soon. The ranch it came from commissioned us to sell it locally." Red stood and walked to the door with Luke. Red told Luke, "I appreciate you checking in on me. Can you do me a favor? When you see Martin in the morning, can you tell him to make sure he checks his email? I want to be professional about this, and I'm going to send him a written resignation." Luke replied, "Sure, Red, no problem. You take care and keep in touch." Red nodded and shook Luke's hand. Then, to Luke's surprise, Red pulled him in for a hug. Luke returned the hug, and after a few moments, Red released him. As he began to walk away, Red told him, "You be careful too, Luke. Really careful." Luke got home that evening and went about his normal before-bed routine of feeding Ms. Meow and himself. He normally turned on the television to watch either the local news or an animated comedy before bed, but that night, he left the TV off. As his cat ate her seafood delight and he ate his microwave lasagna, he did what he often did when he was confused and consulted the cat for her opinion. Knowing that he wouldn't get an actual answer, he said to the cat, "I ask you something, Ms. Meow. Do you believe that aliens exist?" The reason I ask is because there's a lot of weird things going on at the farm, and well, there's just no reasonable explanation for them. But you remember I told you about that green night in the sky? Well, everything started getting weird right about the time that thing appeared. The cat stepped back from her dish and began to clean her paws and face. Luke took another bite of his lasagna and once again consulted the cat, saying, "So I'm pretty positive that Victoria's into me. I play it cool, but the truth is, I'm still too chicken shit to ask her out. The worst part is Oscar knows it. I'm using work as an excuse to avoid it. I just hope she doesn't. And I don't know how long she's gonna wait. What do you think I should do, Mizzy?" Just then, a loud thud came from the backyard. Ms. Meow jumped and took a defensive posture. Then the growls and snarls of a bobcat could be heard. Ms. Meow ran and hid under the couch, and Luke got up to see what was happening. But before he got to the back door, another growl could be heard, and then something slammed against the door, hard. Luke had guns hidden all over his house. As he approached the back door, he stopped and opened a drawer in the kitchen to retrieve a .38 that he kept there. He cautiously approached the back door and raised the shade that was on it. He looked out the window, but didn't see anything in the backyard. He reached down and grasped the door handle and slowly turned it. Unexpectedly, as the door latch released, the weight of something pushed against the door, opening it. As Luke stepped back, the carcass of the bobcat that had been pestering the neighborhood flopped to the floor at his feet. Luke aimed the gun at the animal and realized that it did not appear to be breathing. He carefully knelt down and poked it with the pistol, but it did not move. Its mouth hung open and its eyes were glazed over, but open. It was definitely dead. Luke quickly stood back up and stepped out the door, aiming his gun into the backyard. He looked around the yard from the doorway, but saw nothing unusual when he scanned. His backyard wasn't very big, so he could see the whole thing from where he stood. He scanned and rescanned, aiming the .38 in every direction as he looked. But there was no sign of whatever killed the bobcat. A hissing sound startled him, and he turned to see Ms. Meow standing in the kitchen. Her back was raised, and she hissed at the bobcat carcass. Luke told her, "It's okay, Mizzy. He's dead." Then he reached down and dragged the carcass out the doorway and aside on the porch. Then he went back inside to call the county animal care and control. As he closed the door behind him, a figure slowly began to move in the darkness. Someone or something was on the roof. It laid down and peeked its head over the edge to look down at the bobcat and where Luke had just been standing. A little while later, back at the farm, Teddy was walking the grounds. Teddy did security rounds more often than anyone else. Every hour on the hour was Teddy's motto. Teddy did freelance work as a handyman when he wasn't working security at the farm, and he was a guy who took all of his jobs very seriously. Lorenzo had told him about what happened with Red, and Teddy was sad to hear it. He didn't often get the chance to interact with Red, but he did like Red. He hoped that Red would be okay and would return to work soon. He was concerned about whatever had frightened Red and was trying to be extra careful in his rounds to make sure that he wasn't surprised by the same thing. Teddy had checked his emails when he first arrived at work and had read the memo that Oscar sent out about the bullpen. Teddy was terrified of Creed as it was, and always a little anxious whenever he was near the bullpen. He approached the area with extra caution, bypassed the bullpen completely at first, walking as far from it as he could to approach the barn. He could hear Creed stir and snort as he approached, and he paused for a moment. When it sounded like Creed had settled down, he continued. First he walked the perimeter of the barn and everything seemed fine. He looked over the empty corral with his torch, and again, everything seemed normal. He looked over toward the bullpen and paused again. Teddy knew that his fear of Creed was irrational. The bull had never actually done anything to him or anyone else for that matter. But the animal's size and demeanor had always made Teddy uneasy. He took a deep breath, released it, and began walking toward the bullpen to check its perimeter. He approached the pen and began his check between it and the corral. He circled the bullpen, and about halfway around he heard Creed stir again. As he walked around the pen, the bull seemed to become agitated as it listened to Teddy's footsteps. Teddy decided to try and comfort Creed, saying, "Hey, it's okay, big guy. I'm just checking to make sure you're safe and sound. It's me, Teddy. I ain't gonna hurt you." Teddy felt silly talking to the bull, but he continued to do it as he finished circling the bullpen to make himself feel better. He called out, "I'm almost done, big boy. Then I'll leave you alone. I have to check the main house." As he completed his phrase, Teddy made it around to where he had begun his check. Creed was now snorting a lot, and Teddy could hear the bull running around inside the pen. The steers inside the barn began to make noise as well. Teddy began to panic and called out to Creed, "I'm sorry, big fella. I'm all done. I'm gonna go now. You can settle down." What Teddy didn't realize is that while he was trying to calm the bull down, a shadowy figure was slowly crawling across the roof of the barn behind him to get a better look at him. Suddenly, Creed let out a loud bellow and charged the fence and rammed into it with all his might. Teddy stumbled backward and fell down from the shock. The dark figure on the roof of the barn held still for a moment. Creed rammed the fence again, and the sound of wood cracking was loudly audible. Teddy struggled to get to his feet as Crete once again rammed the fence, and one of the boards visibly split completely. Teddy got to his feet and ran for the guard shack, which was not the closest, but in his panicked state, he thought it would be the safest place to go. He'd only gotten a few steps when Crete completely splintered the bullpen fence with one last powerful blow. Teddy was too scared to look back. He focused on the guard shack that now seemed to be a mile away. He didn't see that behind him, Crete charged at the barn and slammed into the side of it. He broke holes in the wall, and the steers on the side began to snort and bellow when it frightened them. The shadow on the roof grasped to keep it from falling, and the bull shook the whole barn. The shadow, whose form was humanoid, pointed an arm in Crete's direction. A short but very loud sound emitted from there, and suddenly, the bull, who was again charging at the wall of the barn, was hit in the face by a concussive wave. The blast stunned the bull and spun him around halfway. Crete shook off the hit and opened his eyes to see Teddy still running for the guard shack. In his rage, Crete charged to try to catch Teddy. The shadow atop the barn hopped down off the roof. It foraged around on the ground for a moment, looking for something, and then it ran off into the darkness of the fields. Teddy was almost to the shack, but was running short of breath. Suddenly, he heard Crete snort and realized that the bull was now giving chase. A second wind came over Teddy, and he rushed to reach the safety of the guard shack. He reached the shack and struggled up the stairs. He fumbled to open the door and managed to get inside. He closed the door behind him and leaned back against it. He could hear Crete's bellows and snorts, but he thought he was safe inside the trailer. It would quickly be made clear to him, however, that he was not. Just as Teddy was attempting to catch his breath, Crete slammed into the side of the guard shack, shaking the whole trailer. The bull rammed the trailer repeatedly, and Teddy screamed in panic as the trailer shook and teetered. Outside, the bull was fully infuriated and was taking all his frustrations out on the guard shack. He smashed the flimsy wooden and metal staircase that was used to access the trailer. Inside, Teddy was being tossed around and bounced off the walls and floor. Each time the bull rammed the side of the trailer, it tilted, and Teddy feared it would fall over. His fears would manifest as Crete managed to get just the right grip on the trailer's base with his horns, and with a mighty swing of his highly muscled neck, the bull lifted the trailer off the ground, and it fell over onto its side. Inside, Teddy was helpless as he slammed against the wall of the trailer as it fell. It hit the ground, and the monitors, filing cabinets, chairs, and all manner of office furniture and supplies toppled onto Teddy and pinned him beneath it. His forehead was bleeding, and he was in tremendous pain as the deluge of debris had caused a lot of physical damage that he could not assess. Outside, Crete paced for a moment, seemingly surveying his handiwork, before running off into the farm's open field of crops. Luke and Martin both arrived at the farm early the next morning, and were the first ones to discover the chaos the farm had been left in after Crete's rampage. After initially finding the bullpen fence shattered and the side of the barn smashed up, Martin looked off into the distance and saw the guard shack trailer toppled over on its side. Simultaneously, Luke spotted Crete out in one of the alfalfa fields. The bull was just grazing peacefully, but the wreckage of the guard shack was more concerning to both of them, since they hadn't seen Teddy anywhere. Chelsea arrived while Luke and Martin were still mentally processing the situation. Luke told them to search the guard shack for signs of Teddy while he dealt with Crete. Martin and Chelsea rushed to the guard shack, and Luke pulled out his phone. He began walking toward the stables and called Oscar. Oscar answered after only a few rings, saying, "Morning, Luke. What is it today?" Luke explained, "Something happened last night. Crete broke loose and the guard shack was trashed. He's out in the fields right now. I'll need you to pull the trailer while I wrangle him." Oscar replied with urgency in his voice, asking, "He's still on the property? Is Teddy okay?" Luke had kept his eyes on Crete the entire time and answered Oscar, saying, "We couldn't find Teddy. Martin and Chelsea are checking out the guard shack. I'm heading over to the stables to fetch Lucky and a rope. I'll wait for you to get here to lasso him." Oscar quickly responded, "I'm already in my truck. I'll be there in a few minutes." Luke reached the stables and gathered up a rope, some gloves, and a saddle and bridle set. He rushed over to one of the stalls and said to the horse in it, "Morning, Lucky. We got work to do." Lucky was the go-to horse when the actual cowboy work needed to be done. He was a wild horse previously that had been rescued when some college kids found him stuck in some rocks near a river, hence the name. He had suffered some injuries and was brought to the farm to be rehabilitated by Dr. Barker. When he was healed, he seemed to have taken to being around people and displayed a natural ability to take training. Luke was the one to put shoes on him and break him for riding, though he said it was the easiest time he'd ever had breaking a horse. The two bonded and were the ones to call when any of the livestock got loose and needed to be wrangled. Luke quickly saddled and bridled Lucky and walked the horse out of the stable. He looked out over the fields and saw that Crete was still calmly grazing. He mounted up and rode over to the guard shack to check on Martin and Chelsea to wait for Oscar to arrive. When he reached the shack, Chelsea was kneeling atop the toppled shack, looking down into one of the shattered windows. Luke stopped the horse and could hear Martin talking inside the trailer. Luke asked Chelsea, "Is Teddy inside there?" Chelsea replied, "Yeah, he's conscious, but he's pinned under some stuff. Martin is trying to dig him out. He may be hurt pretty bad." Luke noticed that Chelsea had her phone in her hand and asked, "Did you guys call an ambulance?" Chelsea replied, "Yeah, I still have them on the line. The dispatcher said to remain on the line until they arrive." Luke called out so that he could be heard over Chelsea's phone and said, "Excuse me, dispatch." The emergency dispatcher replied that she could hear him, and he continued saying, "Can you tell them when they're close to shut off the lights and sirens, please? We have a 2,000-pound bull loose in the fields. He's calm right now, but the emergency vehicles may spook him and chase him off the property, and that would be bad." The dispatcher could be heard through Chelsea's phone reply,
Copy that. I will forward the information to the rings.
As the dispatcher was speaking, Luke could see Oscar's truck driving up the entry road. He told Chelsea not to let Martin move anything too heavy and not to move Teddy around too much in case he was hurt badly. Then he clicked at Lucky and rode to meet up with Oscar at the main house. Crete had his own personal transport trailer that was usually parked between the main house and the barn. When Luke reached the spot, Oscar was already hooking the trailer up to his truck. Luke called out to Oscar saying, "I'll go ahead of you and rope him. By the time you're set up here, just meet up with me. I'll be ready." Oscar gave him a thumbs up and Luke rode off to catch Crete. The bull was still grazing in the field when Luke and Lucky approached. Luke signaled the horse to slow to a walk, then he cautiously approached, and as they closed in, Crete raised his head and made eye contact with Luke. Luke pulled the reins and Lucky stopped in his tracks. Crete watched, and Luke said to the bull, "Easy, big boy. You've had a night out. It's time for last call. You can't be running around on your own. You might hurt someone, or yourself." Luke clicked at Lucky and the horse began a slow walk, circling the bull. Crete began to snort and bellow as he watched Luke and Lucky. Without warning, the bull turned and began to run. Luke clicked his heels and let out loud, "Yeah, Lucky!" and the horse took off in pursuit. Crete was running toward the old burned-down farmhouse, and Luke knew he needed to catch him before he got there, because after that, there was a short run to a major surface street. Luke grabbed the rope he had hung from the saddle and gently whipped Lucky on the flank, and the horse sped up. They quickly closed in on Crete and were now side by side. The bull bellowed loudly as he again made eye contact with Luke. The angry bull tried to lunge at Lucky, but the once wild horse was far too nimble and easily dodged Crete's attack. The bull stumbled for a moment, slowing his momentum. Luke was already swinging his lasso and waiting for an opportunity to rope the bull. When Crete lunged at them, he got his chance. He flung the lasso at the bull's front legs and timed it perfectly. The bull stepped into the loop, and Luke pulled it taut. He pulled back on the reins with his free hand and ordered Lucky with a loud, "Whoa, buddy, we got him." Luke directed Lucky, and the horse made sure to keep enough distance to hold the rope tight, and Crete submitted to defeat. Despite Crete's size, he was helpless as Luke and Lucky led him around by the leg they were holding off the ground. Oscar arrived quickly at the bull trailer and was actually shocked that Luke had already had Crete under control. The bull had never gotten loose before, and Oscar had feared how they would deal with it if he ever did. He'd seen Luke wrangle the occasional runaway steer, but Crete was, as some say, an entirely different animal. Just a few minutes before, he had questioned Luke's confidence about having Crete ready by the time he pulled up with the trailer. Now, here Luke was, looking like one of those paintings of a cowboy you see in Western-themed steakhouses. Oscar pulled the truck as close to them as he could and got out to get the trailer ready. He opened the gate and set up the ramp, and Luke and Lucky dragged Crete into position. Surprisingly, once they had the bull by the ramp, he walked up on his own and settled into the trailer. Luke and Oscar secured the trailer and took a moment to breathe. Neither of them had noticed, but the emergency vehicles had arrived at the farm. They looked over and could see firefighters and paramedics rushing equipment to the guard shack. Oscar turned to Luke and asked, "I don't suppose we have too many details about what happened yet?" Luke tipped his hat back and grabbed Lucky's bridle and answered, "No, Teddy is pinned under everything inside the trailer. Martin's trying to dig him out. Jesse said he may be hurt pretty bad, but he was awake and aware. The side of the barn's banged up too. We had a full day's work ahead of us." Oscar nodded in acknowledgement as Luke mounted Lucky. Luke told him, "I'll take Lucky back to the stable, head over to the hardware store." Oscar replied, "I'll park him behind the barn, check on Teddy before I check everything else out." Luke nodded and clicked at Lucky. The horse turned around and headed toward the stables. A little while later, Luke returned from the hardware store. In the bed of his truck, he had a stack of lumber. He backed his truck up to the corral area and got out. Oscar had already retrieved the tools they needed from the storage shed and begun cleaning up the rubble, and had some of the old wood they could salvage set aside. Luke got out of the truck and walked to the back to lower the tailgate. As Oscar walked over to meet him, Luke asked him, "How's Teddy?" "Saw the ambulance leaving as I was coming back." Oscar replied, "He's got a broken arm, possible concussion, and maybe a couple busted ribs too, but they think he's gonna be okay. They took him to Estrella and said that he'd probably be admitted for overnight observation. I was thinking I'd go check on him after we get the corral and the barn patched up." Luke nodded and said, "I'll go with you. If he's up to talking, I'd like to find out what happened last night. How's Crete behaving?" Oscar replied, "He's surprisingly calm considering he's not used to being pinned up in the transport trailer. He's not going to stay that way though." Luke nodded his head again and said, "You're right, we better get to work." He gazed over at the staff parking area and noticed a car he knew but was not used to seeing on site. He asked Oscar, "Philip decided to show up for this one, huh?" Oscar stopped unloading wood for a moment and looked up, pointed at the wreckage that used to be the guard shack, and replied, "Yeah, he's over there yelling at Martin and Chelsea. Probably trying to find a way to make this their fault." The two shared a chuckle, and then both put on tool belts and began repairing the bullpen. The repairs in the bullpen didn't take nearly as long as either man had predicted. Both of them were very experienced at building and repairing corrals, so Crete was back running free in his pen within a few hours. He didn't seem as cranky as usual, and Luke figured that he was just happy to be out of the trailer. After getting the bull settled, they were able to finally move the steers to the corral so they could feed them and fix the damage to the barn wall. They'd been so focused on wrangling and settling Crete that they hadn't yet been inside the barn. The barn wall was caved in as support beams had all held when Crete rammed it. Oscar and Luke didn't want to stress out the steers any more than they already were, so they left them in the barn while they worked on the Crete situation. When they finally opened the barn doors to move the steers, they discovered something else that they were not expecting. The Japanese shorthorn was gone. Luke was the first to realize it, and when he pointed it out to Oscar, the two men stood dumbfounded for a moment. They finished moving the steers to the corral and closed the gate. Then Oscar ran toward the back of the barn. Luke quickly followed, wondering what he was doing. The two men stopped and Oscar began scanning the fields for the shorthorn. When Luke realized what Oscar was doing, he gave his opinion, saying, "He ain't out there, Oscar. We just spotted him by now." Oscar fired back an anxious reply saying, "Well, where the hell is he?" Luke tried to keep his cool, knowing that Oscar was losing his, but inside he was freaking out too. He attempted to sort things out by saying, "Look, I'm just saying, the barn door was still latched, and the wall is smashed up a bit, but there's no way he could have gotten out. Even if he had, Crete would have either chased him off, or one of us would have spotted him right around the grounds. Oscar tipped his hat back and turned to walk back to the front of the barn. As Luke followed, Oscar said, "Seems this deer vanished the same way it got here, out of nowhere, and all our security cameras are offline." The two men reached the front of the barn and stopped. Oscar stared at the steers in the corral, and Luke could tell that he was counting them again. As Oscar tried to figure out where the shorthorn could have gone, a large flatbed truck made its way up the roadway from the main entrance. The noise caught the men's attention, and they looked over to see it had another mobile trailer for a load. The truck completely bypassed the main farmhouse and drove straight to the location of the wrecked trailer. Luke and Oscar watched as the truck stopped and Philip approached it. The driver got out and began talking to him. After a moment, they saw Philip wave his hand in a come-with-me gesture, and Philip, Martin, and Chelsea began walking toward them. Oscar turned to Luke and said, "Guess we better look busy." The two walked over and began assessing the damage to the barn wall. They had been so focused on getting the bullpen back together and Crete back in it, they hadn't fully looked over it. After a moment, Luke said to Oscar, "It's not that bad. We may be able to push it back from the inside like a dent. Then we can reinforce it and worry about making it pretty later." Luke had no sooner finished the last sentence when Philip's voice chimed in from behind them saying, "We need to make it look pretty now." Luke and Oscar turned to see Philip standing behind them with Martin and Chelsea in tow. Philip continued saying, "The grand reopening is expected to go as planned. We need to make sure the farm is aesthetically ready for that. It will look bad if our barn appears to have been patched together by school children." As he finished, he looked over toward the repaired bullpen. Oscar started to say something, but Luke interrupted, saying, "Morning to you too, Philip, and long time no see. You're welcome for catching the bull and getting him back in his pen. How's Teddy, by the way?" Oscar and Martin looked at Luke with wide, shocked eyes, and Chelsea turned her head to conceal her stifled laughter. Philip walked up to Luke and stood directly in front of him. Philip was a tall and imposing man to most, but Luke just looked up at him and smiled. Philip said, "Good morning, Luke, but is it really? I have a barn and a bullpen in shambles, and an insurance nightmare over there with that rented security station. One of my night watchmen walked off the job, and the other is in the hospital on the other side of the freeway. This attraction is scheduled to reopen to the public in 2 weeks, and we have a huge concert scheduled this weekend to kick it off. I have home office breathing down my neck right now." Luke just looked up at Philip and continued to smile. When Philip paused his rant, Luke spoke up and said, "You feel better?" He looked over toward the remnants of the guard shack and then looked back at Philip and said, "Seems you already got a handle on replacing the guard shack. Nothing you can do about the insurance but file a claim to wait and hear from them. Red and Teddy went through some shit, so you gotta be able to go show a little compassion toward them. The bullpen is fixed. The barn will be. What are you freaking out over, Philip?" Luke paused for a moment to look around. Oscar and Martin were still frozen in fear, and Chelsea covered her mouth. Luke turned back to Philip and continued saying, "None of this will change anything about the reopening, unless they can't get the security cameras back online." Luke pointed at the men working on the guard shack. Philip's eyes were bulging out of his skull and his nostrils flared. Luke continued saying, "Maybe if you were here more often, you'd understand better that this crew has everything under control and you have the easiest damn job in the world." Luke paused and looked around again. Even Chelsea was beginning to look uneasy. Luke turned back toward Philip and said, "Now I was serious. How's Teddy?" Philip leered at Luke, but Luke stood his ground. After an awkward moment, Philip replied, "He's in pain, but he'll be fine." He looked over at Oscar and Martin and said, "I want to know as soon as the guard station is set up and the cameras are once again operational." Martin nodded his head in agreement. Philip then spoke to Oscar, saying, "There are a few potential buyers for the Wagyu steer. Is it still healthy?" Oscar and Luke looked at each other. Philip detected their uneasiness and looked back and forth at the both of them. Luke said, "Yeah, about that." Philip rushed over to the barn doors and opened them to peer inside. He closed the doors and turned around to ask, "Where's the shorthorn?" Luke started to speak, but Oscar cut him off and replied, We don't exactly know. We were so concerned with getting Crete back in his pen before he hurt someone that we didn't notice it was gone when we checked on the steers this morning. Philip slowly walked over to Oscar saying, "Are you telling me that the Shorthorn escaped last night as well?" Oscar replied, "We aren't sure what happened. We noticed it was gone. We moved the steers to corral after we got Crete situated a few minutes ago." Philip asked, "How could it possibly have gotten out?" Oscar replied, "The barn doors were secure and the wall was in the same condition you see now. Your guess is as good as mine." Philip threw his hands in the air and declared, "Well, go find it." Luke couldn't help but to chime in again, asking, "What do you want us to do? Knock on doors and ask if anyone's seen a Japanese cow running around?" Philip walked over and stood face to face with Luke. Luke pointed at the barn and continued saying, "There's no way that steer snuck out of there. Even if it did, we've been listening to the radio while rebuilding the pen, and I think if anyone had reported a steer running around the city streets, it'd be on the news report by now." Philip interrupted, "So did it just vanish into thin air?" Luke quickly fired back, saying, "You mean the same way it got here?" "Maybe." The two men paused and stared at each other for a moment. Oscar, Martin, and Chelsea anxiously awaited the next words in this exchange. Luke broke the silence, saying, "Someone had to have let it out or taken it. That's all I'm saying. Maybe after Crete broke loose and wrecked the place, someone snuck on site and took the steer. Unfortunately, we can't check because the cameras are all down." Philip continued to stare down Luke. His breathing was slow and loud, like he was stifling rage. Crete let out a loud bellow and snorted during the silence. Luke looked over toward the bullpen and then back into Philip's eyes. He chuckled and said, "If he doesn't scare me, Philip, what makes you think you do?" Philip then charged off and began power walking toward the parking area. When Luke noticed that Philip was not headed toward the main farmhouse, he couldn't help but say something again and shouted, "You leaving again, Philip?" Philip opened his car door, and before getting in, he looked at Luke and said, "I have to go perform some damage control. Things are getting out of hand." Then he got into the car, started it, and drove off. Martin's ringtone went off, and he told Oscar, "The IT guy is on his way here to set up the security cameras in the new shack." He looked at Chelsea, she nodded, and the two walked over toward the main farmhouse to greet the technician. Oscar said to Luke, "We better get that wall patched up." The two men walked over to the barn, and Oscar said, "I'll go inside and try to push the boards back out. Keep an eye on the outside and let me know if it looks like we can reinforce it now, like we talked about." Luke nodded, and the men split up. As Luke walked around the corner and approached the broken area of the barn wall, he happened to glance down and noticed something. On the ground next to the barn was a strange black object. Luke squatted down and picked it up. The object lit up when Luke picked it up. It was about the size of a mobile phone, but oval-shaped and solid black. As Luke ran his thumb across the surface of it, different symbols lit up in different colors. It appeared to be some kind of device, but wasn't like anything Luke had ever seen. He was no tech head, but Luke had a feeling this object had something to do with whatever had happened the night before. Possibly even all the strange occurrences that had been plaguing the farm. Luke heard Oscar shout from the inside of the barn, "How's it look? Will it be presentable if we just board up the inside?" Luke scrambled to stand and looked over the wall. He shouted back at Oscar, "Yeah, I think it'll be fine." He looked down at the object in his hand, which was still lighting up, muttered to himself, "At least I hope it will." After Oscar and Luke finished reinforcing the barn wall, they walked over to the guard shack area. The crew from the security agency had to borrow the farm's forklift to get the remains of the old guard shack onto their trailer, after placing the new one where it had been. When Luke and Oscar approached, the crew were working on securing the load for transport, which was proving to be a daunting task. Luke and Oscar climbed the stairs and entered the new trailer. Inside, Martin and Chelsea were standing by while the man from the security company's IT department set up the new camera systems. Oscar asked how things were going, and Martin replied, "Well, you should be done getting this stuff online within the next hour. I'm getting ready to head home and attempt a power nap so I can come cover the graveyard shift tonight." Philip said he'd talked to our superior today, and they're working on assigning people to replace Red and Teddy. Oscar began telling Martin that he was going to see Teddy at the hospital on the way home when Luke remembered the device in his pocket. He reached into his pocket and pulled it out. He held it in his hand and stared at it for a moment. Then he interrupted the conversation, saying, Hey Martin, I found this over by the barn. All eyes, save the IT guys, were focused on Luke as he held the device out for Martin to look at. Martin stepped closer to Luke and took the device from him. He stared at it in confusion for a moment, turning around every which way in an attempt to form some recognition as to what the device may be. When he had concluded his makeshift examination, Martin looked up at Luke and asked, "What is this?" Luke chuckled and replied, "I was hoping you'd be able to tell me. It lights up when you touch it in certain places. I've never seen anything like it anywhere. Can't tell if it's plastic or metal or stone. So what was it doing on the ground near the busted wall of the barn?" Martin began fiddling with the device again and saw what Luke was talking about as it once again lit up with different colors and symbols that Luke had seen before. The IT guy from the security company now craned his neck to see what they were talking about. Martin appeared almost mesmerized by the device for a moment. When he was finally finished playing with it, he looked around and asked, "Should I put it in the lost and found?" Oscar quickly replied, "The only people that have been on the grounds recently are staff and emergency crews. And Luke and I are the only ones who got near the barn. Who could have lost it?" Martin shrugged his shoulders and looked down at the device in his hand again. Luke interjected, saying, "I was kind of thinking it may have something to do with what happened last night. Maybe it belongs to someone that has something to do with the Shorthorn. Can you take it to the police and have them dust for fingerprints or swab for DNA or something?" Martin looked and said, "Well, unfortunately, we should have thought of that before we started messing around with it. Our fingerprints and DNA are all over it now, so I don't know if the police would be able to find anything. And without security footage, they'll probably just blow us off without looking into it." Oscar spoke up to ask, "So what do we do then? What if that does belong to whoever's been causing all the havoc around here lately?" Martin again looked down at the device that he held, took a deep breath and said, "I guess we'd hang on to it and see if someone comes looking for it." Oscar replied, "That sounds better than giving it to the cops and having them toss it in a box in an evidence locker." Martin nodded in agreement and walked over to the cabinet. He opened a drawer and began to place the device in it, but Oscar stopped him when he noticed the IT guy watching. He told Martin, "You may want to keep that on you. We don't need anyone breaking in and taking it." Martin nodded again and placed the device into his shirt pocket. Martin then looked over at Chelsea and asked, "You got a handle on things until I get back?" Chelsea nodded and said, "Yeah, no problem. I'll do the regular rounds and check in on this guy as I go." She pointed her thumb at the IT guy who was working diligently to get the security cameras online. Martin then declared, "Okay, I'm going to go head home." He walked out the door, down the stairs, and Oscar and Luke followed. Later that evening, Martin pulled back into the staff parking area. It was dark now, and he was only expecting to see Lorenzo's car when he returned, but as he parked, there were two other vehicles in the staff parking area, Luke's truck and Victoria's car. The hood of the car was open, and Luke hunched over the engine compartment while Victoria stood by observing. As Martin got out of his car and walked around, he could see the tailgate of Luke's truck was down, and a toolbox sat on it with various tools spread out around it. He walked up and said, "Hey, Victoria, Luke." Victoria enthusiastically replied, "Hi, Marty." And Luke grunted, "What's up, Martin?" from beneath the hood. Martin then asked, "What you working on?" Luke stood up straight and picked up a rag that was resting on the car's fender. He wiped his hand and replied, "Alternator. Wasn't easy to get to when I just finished." He looked at Victoria and asked, "You want to try and fire it up?" Victoria responded, "I tell you what, you boys give it a shot. I need to run inside and use the restroom real quick. My drive home can seem a little long when you gotta go." She patted Luke on the shoulder and quickly walked toward the main farmhouse. As Luke and Martin watched her walk away, Luke asked, "Why does she call you Marty if she calls me Lucas?" Martin laughed and replied, "Guess she likes it, you big dummy. When are you gonna ask her out?" Luke, embarrassed, replied, "Not you two." Martin climbed in the driver's seat of Victoria's car and attempted to start it. The engine started right away. As Martin got out of the car, Victoria came jogging back. She ran up to Luke, and to Luke's dismay, she threw her arms around him and embraced him tightly. Luke froze awkwardly as Victoria squeezed him and shouted, "Thank you so much, Lucas. I'll see you tomorrow." She kissed Luke aggressively on the cheek and released her embrace. She quickly hopped into the driver's seat and proclaimed, "Good night, Marty, and good luck staying awake." She closed the door as Luke closed the hood, and she backed out and drove off, honking as she pulled away. Luke watched her drive off and then looked over at Martin, who was giggling to himself. He said to Luke, "I gotta go catch up with Lorenzo." Have a good night, Lucas. Luke began cleaning up his tools on the tailgate. Martin reached the barn area and heard Crete snort. He called out, "How's it going, Crete?" Then he felt a warmth and a vibration from his shirt pocket. He stopped and pulled the device Luke had found earlier from his pocket. It was vibrating and humming. He ran his thumb across it and some of the symbols lit up. It began to light up and vibrate harder. Martin turned around and saw that Luke was still packing up his tools. He called out to him, "Hey, Luke!" Luke turned around and Martin held the device up so Luke could see it. He shouted, "This thing's activating on its own." In the distance, Luke couldn't see the vibration or hear the humming, but he could definitely see the device lighting up. Suddenly, the entire area began to light up with a green glow. Martin and Luke began to look around as the light became brighter and brighter. They both looked up to the sky and could barely see the outline of an egg-shaped object that was producing the light. It became so bright that they couldn't continue to look at it. And as the two men shielded their eyes, Martin called out, "Is that a U-fucking-O?" The device in Martin's hand now emitted a blinding green light much like the egg in the sky. Then, out of nowhere, the entire area flashed brightly, and the light was gone. Luke slowly opened his eyes, and as the blur left them, he realized that Martin was gone. Crete snorted and bellowed loudly and angrily. Luke stood dumbfounded for a moment, looking around for Martin. He called out, "Martin! Martin, where'd you go?" He got no response. Headlights lit the staff parking area, and Luke turned to see Victoria's car pulling back in. She stopped without parking properly in the space and got out. She ran toward Luke, shouting, "Lucas, are you okay?" She reached the spot where Luke was standing and grabbed both his arms. She looked him over and asked, "What was that?" Luke was thrown off a little by Victoria's concern and took a moment to answer her. She finished her inspection of his well-being and looked up at him. He shook off the confusion and finally said, "I'm fine. What are you doing back?" Victoria took a step back and appeared almost embarrassed. She replied, "I was still on the property when I got a text from a friend, so I stopped on the access road to check it. And then that light blinded me, and I thought something might have happened to you." She paused for a moment to think about her phrasing and continued saying, "You and Martin and Lorenzo, so I decided to come back to check on you. You guys." Luke and Victoria stood silent for a moment, just staring at each other. Then the silence was broken when they heard Lorenzo ask, "You guys okay? You see that flash of light?" Luke replied, "Yeah, we did. We're good. You okay?" Lorenzo jogged up to them and stopped and replied, "Yeah, just a little freaked out. That's the same light I saw before." He paused when he noticed Martin's car and asked, "Where's Martin?" Luke looked at Victoria as if to seek support for what he was about to say. She waited his response as eagerly as Lorenzo did. Luke looked at Lorenzo and said, "I don't know." He was standing right over there next to the bullpen. When the sky lit up, when the light went away, he was gone. Lorenzo looked at Luke, confused, and asked, "What do you mean he was gone?" Luke looked at Victoria. She appeared as confused as Lorenzo. Luke explained as best he could, saying, "I mean, he called out to me and showed me that gadget I found this morning. Then the light happened. When it was over, he wasn't standing there anymore. I know it doesn't make sense, but I can't explain it any other way." Victoria asked, "What gadget?" Luke explained, "Nobody knew what it was. I found it by the barn when Oscar and I were fixing it. Martin was hanging on to it in case somebody came back for it. I guess someone did. It lit up like the Vegas Strip before the light flashed." Lorenzo asked, "Did you see the egg?" Luke replied hesitantly, "I did." Victoria said, "I saw it too, right before it got too bright to look at." As the three of them were attempting to decipher what had just happened, Crete began to bellow and snort again. The steers inside the barn could be heard lowing and bellowing as well. Even the horses in the stable and the sheep and the goats in the petting zoo could be heard making a ruckus in the distance. Luke, Lorenzo, Victoria all looked around in different directions, confused as to what was causing the animals to go into a frenzy. Victoria grabbed Luke's arm and moved in behind him, holding onto his arm for comfort. Crete slammed into the wall of the bullpen as he had the night before. Victoria and Lorenzo both jumped at the sound of the crash. Then Luke spotted what was making the bull, and probably the rest of the animals, anxious. Atop the farmhouse stood a slender, gray figure that appeared to be watching them. Crete slammed into the bullpen wall again. The figure focused its attention on the bull and raised its hand as if to aim its palm at Crete. The bull began to charge the wall of the pen again when suddenly a shockwave of some kind emitted from the hand of the gray figure. Like the night before, Crete was hit by an invisible wall of force before he toppled over his own hooves and came to a rest on his side on the ground of the bullpen. The figure then refocused its attention on Luke, Victoria, and Lorenzo. It leapt from the roof of the farmhouse, landing on the ground with an inhuman grace, and began walking toward them. Lorenzo drew his stun gun from his belt and pointed it at the figure. The trio circled, keeping an eye on the apparent aggressor, while moving toward the corral area. The figure continued to approach, and Lorenzo called out, saying, "Don't come any closer, I'm gonna zap you, you motherfucker." The figure continued its slow, dramatic approach. Luke told Victoria, "I want you to run for the guard shack, or the amusement park, or anywhere but here. Run, hide, and call for help." Victoria replied, "I'm trying to pull any macho shit, Lucas. What about you guys?" Luke responded, "We can all split up or something. We'll figure it out. But you get to safety first." Victoria replied, "Just don't try to be heroes." Then she ran toward the bullpen with the intention of circling it to head for the guard shack. Unfortunately, she didn't get far before the figure quickly raised its hand and hit her with the same concussive wave it had used on Crete. Victoria was knocked off her feet by the force and flung into the corral fence. Lorenzo panicked and fired the stun gun at the figure. The taser darts hit the mark, and the figure began to convulse with the weapon sent 75,000 bolts into the aggressor. The figure convulsed for a brief moment, then reached down and pulled the taser darts from its chest and abdomen, and continued its advance. Luke began sidestepping his way closer to Victoria, who was still unconscious on the ground. Lorenzo drew his maglite torch from his belt and held it up like a baseball bat. The gray figure stopped and tilted its head, observing Lorenzo's actions. Luke used the opportunity to run for Victoria. Luke reached Victoria and knelt next to her. He checked her neck and felt a pulse, which gave him a moment of relief that was quickly shattered by Lorenzo screaming, "Come on, motherfucker, you want to do this? If you're the one who fucked up my friends, I'm gonna fuck you up." The gray figure straightened its head again and held its hand palm facing Lorenzo. Lorenzo released a guttural scream and charged at the figure, but his efforts were in vain as it released another shockwave, which flung Lorenzo across the staff parking lot and out into the darkness. The figure then quickly changed its focus to Luke and Victoria. It began to slowly walk toward them, and Luke stood in defiance. He shouted at the figure, "The hell do you want? The short horn? It's gone. Did you take Martin? Red? Teddy? Was that you too?" He stood over Victoria and shouted, "I don't know and I don't care why you're here, or what you want, but I won't let you hurt this woman again." The figure stopped its advance and stood still, tilting its head in curiosity again. Luke was finally able to get a good look at the figure, and didn't want to believe his eyes when he got a closer look. With the exception of being much taller, it looked just like the typical description that everyone ever heard when someone describes aliens from outer space. It was gray all over, like it didn't wear clothing. It was slender with long arms and fingers. It had a bulbous head with a very small mouth, and lacked any apparent nose or ears, and most eerie were the two very large, black, teardrop-shaped eyes. Luke took a few steps in front of Victoria. He took the best defensive posture he could assume against the apparently unbeatable foe he faced. Luke didn't have any weapons on him, but he clenched his fist while his eyes teared up from rage. The figure tilted its head the other direction, displaying further curiosity. He raised its hand, palm facing Luke, and Luke didn't wait. He charged at the figure, not even knowing exactly what he was going to do, and was hit by an unseen force as he closed in. The blast felt like a car crash and hurled Luke off his feet into the air. He felt his back slam against something, which sent him flipping head over heels until he hit the ground and rolled several feet before finally coming to a rest. He laid face down in the dirt for a moment, attempting to catch his breath as the force had knocked the wind from his lungs. He lifted his head in an attempt to look around and saw the figure crawl over the fence. Its movements seemed more reptilian in nature than anything else, and as it finished scaling the fence, it dismounted like an acrobat and stood studying Luke for a moment. Luke looked around and realized where the blast from the figure had knocked him to. He was in pain and out of breath, but he was able to muster up the strength to shout at the figure. "Is that all you got? You came all this way from who knows where the hell, and you pick on some natives, and that's the best you can do? I always thought an alien invasion would be terrifying, but you know what? You don't scare me." The figure tilted its head again and raised its palm to Luke. Luke braced for another blast he was thinking was going to finish him. He pushed himself up onto his knees and strained up the best he could, shouting, "Come on!" The figure straightened its head and appeared ready to deliver another concussive blast to Luke. Before it got the chance, though, Crete slammed into the figure with all the might the bull had in its massive body. The figure looked like a crash test dummy between the bull's horns as Crete smashed it into the wall of the bullpen. The bull backed up after the impact, and the limp body of the figure hit the ground. It quickly rose to hands and knees and began to stand again before it could regain its footing. Crete rammed it again, smashing it against the wall of the bullpen again. The bull smashed against the wall again and again, and the figure was helpless against the incredible power of the beast. Crete quickly spun and kicked, sending the figure flying into the bullpen one last time. The figure slumped to the ground and laid motionless. Crete turned and looked at Luke. The bull made eye contact with Luke, and Luke muttered, "Thank you, cranky old bastard." Then he fell forward to the ground and blacked out. A while later, Luke awoke to Victoria saying his name. He opened his eyes, and her face was the first thing he saw when his vision cleared. As his senses came to him, he realized that he was being strapped to a gurney by paramedics. He tried to look around, but his neck was already placed in an immobilizer. Victoria exclaimed, "He's awake! Lucas, can you hear me?" One of the paramedics shone a light in Luke's eyes, and he cringed at the brightness. The paramedic asked, "Can you hear me, Lucas?" Luke replied, "Victoria, you okay?" Victoria laughed and replied, "You're the one on the stretcher, silly." Luke then asked, "Lorenzo, how's he?" Victoria replied, "They already have him in an ambulance. They're getting ready to load you up. I'll ride with you." The paramedic declared, "He's awake and coherent. Let's get him loaded up. You're a lucky guy, Lucas, and I have to say, this is the first bull trampling I've responded to." Luke replied, "It wasn't the bull." The paramedic appeared confused. He looked at Victoria and asked, "What does he mean?" Victoria replied, "I don't know, maybe he's a little loopy." She grabbed Luke's hand and looked down at him, shaking her head. Luke was confused, but began to lose consciousness again. The paramedics got him into the ambulance, and Victoria climbed in and sat next to him. She continued to hold his hand as the paramedics closed the ambulance door. Luke once again passed out. A while later, Luke woke again. This time he was in the hospital bed. Victoria was still grasping his hand. He looked at her and said, "Hey." She giggled and replied, "Hey yourself. How do you feel?" Luke attempted to adjust in the bed and realized how much pain he was in. He grunted and replied, "Like I got caught in a stampede. How's Lorenzo?" Victoria replied, "He's good. Mostly had bumps and bruises, so they actually discharged him already." Luke noticed that Victoria's arm was in a sling and asked, "What about you?" She replied, "Dislocated shoulder. Looks worse than it feels. You got it the worst. Your spleen was ruptured. They had to remove it. And you have a few broken ribs." Luke then asked something he was trying to avoid. He asked, "What about whatever it was?" Victoria looked out the door of the hospital room and back at Luke. She leaned in closer to him and said, "It's gone. The paramedics woke me up too. They said they found Lorenzo, you, and me. Nothing or no one else. It just disappeared." Luke chuckled and cringed at the pain in his ribs. He coughed a few times, then caught his breath and replied, "Of course it did." Victoria laughed, and things got quiet for a moment. The two looked at each other, and Luke asked, "Can I ask you something?" Victoria replied, "Of course." Then Luke asked, "You want to go out sometime?" Victoria laughed again and replied, "It sure took you long enough." The two shared another laugh, and after the raucous calmed, Luke asked, "What about Martin? They find him?" Victoria's face took a somber turn, and she replied, "No, they can't find any sign of him." Luke stared up at the ceiling and said, "What the hell did they do to you, Martin?" Miles away, Martin woke in a completely disoriented state. When his head cleared a little, he realized that he was outdoors. He immediately assumed that he was at the farm as he slowly made his way to his feet to get a better look around. It didn't take long for him to realize that he did not recognize his surroundings at all. He began to panic when suddenly he heard a familiar sound coming from behind him. He turned to see a steer standing behind him. The animal grunted and lowed at him, and after the initial shock wore off, he noticed something familiar about the steer. Martin looked closer and realized that the steer was the Japanese shorthorn from the farm. He got as close as possible and got a look at the brisket tag the steer was wearing to confirm. Sure enough, number 33. As Martin attempted to wrap his head around things, he heard the lowing of other steers. He began to look all around him and realized that he was standing in the middle of a pasture. Then Martin heard an unfamiliar sound behind him. A male voice was shouting at him in Japanese. He turned to see what ironically appeared to be the security guard standing in front of a ranch hand. The security guard held a torchlight up in a threatening posture as he shouted at Martin. Martin put his hands in the air as it was all he could think to do. He shouted back at the security guard, "I'm sorry, I don't speak Japanese. I don't know where I am." The security guard stood straight, still holding his torchlight in his threatening position, and replied in English, "Kuyama Kogan Ranch, why are you trespassing?" Back across the world, at the Greenhaven Country Club, a man dressed in all black entered the office of the club president, Victor Wolf. As the man entered, Mr. Wolf said to him, "Mr. Bjorn, welcome. Were you able to retrieve the carcass in time?" Mr. Bjorn replied, "I was. You will be interested to learn that the tech appears to have advanced." Mr. Wolf replied curiously, "Really? In what ways?" Mr. Bjorn placed what appeared to be the gray head of the figure that had attacked the Greater Valley farm onto Mr. Wolf's desk, and then said, "For starters, the armor appears to have taken on an even more organic nature. The nanotech is more advanced and pliable, and it's been weaponized." A simple mistake by some visitors caused so much chaos and turned a close encounter deadly. Luke and Victoria will have a happy ending, won't they? But poor Martin, a stranger in a strange land and with an unbelievable story to tell. At least the cow made it back over the moon. Until next time, I'm sorry if I scared you.